Hey there, story lovers. This is Harry Reality Bender, and we're bringing you an epic adventure. What if Harry was raised inside the Department of Mysteries and became the deadliest unspeakable in history? Hit like, subscribe, and let's begin this journey. Chapter 1, The Boy in the Dark. The Department of Mysteries did not sleep. Most people who worked in the Ministry of Magic understood this in a vague, bureaucratic way, the way you understand that the post office never truly closes, that someone somewhere is always sorting letters. They knew the department existed on level 9, that it was accessed through a plain black door, and that the people who walked through that door did not discuss what they found on the other side. Beyond that, most ministry employees preferred not to think about it at all. Harry Potter had lived there for 10 years, and he still hadn't seen everything. He was sitting cross-legged on the stone floor of the time room at 3:30 in the morning, which was technically a Tuesday, though the concept of Tuesday had always felt slightly negotiable this deep underground. The bell jars floated around him in their slow, eternal rotation, and the light they threw was that particular shade of deep gold that existed nowhere else in the world, not sunlight, not firelight, but something older than both. Inside the nearest jar, a hummingbird flickered between states. Feathers. Egg. Feathers. Egg. It never chose. Harry watched it the way he watched most things, quietly, completely, with the particular quality of attention that made the unspeakables who trained him either very proud or very uneasy, depending on the day. He was 11 years old. He had a scar on his forehead in the shape of a lightning bolt, and he had stopped thinking about it the way other people apparently thought about it, as a mark, a wound, a symbol, around the time he was 7. To Harry it was just part of his face, the same as his eyes, which were green in a way that made the older unspeakables sometimes go quiet and look at him sideways when they thought he wasn't watching. He was always watching. "You're supposed to be asleep." The voice came from the doorway. Harry didn't turn around. "Blythe was supposed to relieve Okonkwo at 2, he said. "She's late, which means something came in through the northern intake, which means you've been dealing with a containment issue for the last hour and a half and you came here to think, which means it wasn't a small one." A pause. Then the sound of footsteps crossing stone, unhurried, and a man lowered himself into the chair beside the door with the careful movements of someone whose knees had been making complaints for several years. Croker was not an impressive-looking man, which Harry had always privately thought was one of his greatest professional assets. He was somewhere between 60 and ancient, with a face that had folded itself into an expression of permanent mild consideration, the sort of face you'd find on a librarian or a retired schoolteacher. His robes were plain gray. His hands, resting on his knees now, were the hands of a man who had spent decades handling things that didn't want to be handled. He looked at the hummingbird in its jar for a moment. "Northern containment breach," he confirmed. "Resolved. Nothing that needs your attention." "I know," Harry said. "I wasn't offering." Croker smiled, just slightly. "No. You were demonstrating." Harry shrugged with one shoulder. "Force of habit." They sat in the particular comfortable silence that had taken years to build between them, not warm, exactly, but honest. Croker had never been the type to manufacture warmth, and Harry had grown up understanding that the absence of performed affection was not the same as the absence of care. He had 3 books on the floor beside him, all of them open, all of them face down at different pages. A habit Croker had spent 2 years trying to break him of and eventually accepted as a permanent feature. "The Hogwarts letters started today," Croker said. Harry turned a page. "I know. Third one arrived at 6 this evening. They escalate rather quickly once they start." "They do." Harry had read the file on Hogwarts' enchanted enrollment system when he was 9. The letters were tied to a quill and a book that recorded magical births, and the persistence was built into the charm. The school essentially refused to accept non-response as an answer. He'd found it either charming or mildly aggressive depending on his mood at the time. "What did you do with them?" Croker reached into the pocket of his robe and produced 3 envelopes. They were addressed, all of them, in green ink, to Mr. H. Potter, the Time Room, Department of Mysteries, Ministry of Magic, London. He set them on the floor between them. Harry looked at them without picking them up. The address made something shift in his chest in a way he didn't immediately have a word for. "The enchantment found me," he said. "It did. Which I'll admit surprised me slightly. I had wondered if the depth of the wards down here would obscure the location." Croaker tilted his head. "Apparently not. Apparently the book simply writes where the child is, regardless of what anyone might prefer." "Regardless of what anyone might prefer," Harry repeated. He picked up the top envelope, turned it over. The Hogwarts seal was pressed in red wax, an H surrounded by 4 animals. He'd read about it. He'd read about most things. "You've been expecting this." "For some time, yes." "And?" Croaker was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, Croaker was rarely evasive, which was its own kind of rarity in this place, but genuinely considering his words, which Harry had learned to recognize as different. He looked at the bell jars. "You're going," Croaker said. "To Hogwarts. In September." Harry set the envelope down. He looked at the hummingbird. "Feathers. Egg. Feathers. Egg. That's not a suggestion," he said. "No. Or a question." "No." Croaker met his eyes. "It's the next phase of your training." Harry was quiet for a moment, processing this the way he processed most significant information, not reacting first, letting it settle into the shape of things he already knew, finding where it fit. He had known, in the abstract way he knew most things about his own situation, that Hogwarts was eventual. He existed in a magical world. He had a magical education. At some point those two facts would intersect with an institution. He'd simply never been told when, or framed like this, a phase of training, which meant Croaker had been thinking about it differently than Harry had. "What's the objective?" Harry asked. Croaker almost smiled. "What do you think the objective might be?" "Integration," Harry said immediately. "I know the theory of everything you've taught me, but I've never operated in a public magical environment. I've never interacted with people my own age. I've never had to function outside a controlled context." He paused. "You want to know if I work?" "I want to know if you work," Croaker agreed, as if Harry had just said something sensible about the weather. "I also want you to learn things I can't teach you down here. Social architecture. Institutional politics. The particular texture of how ordinary magical people think and move and make decisions." He paused. "And I want you to be 11 years old for a while." Harry looked at him. "That last part is genuine," Croaker said quietly. "Not strategic." Harry looked away. The hummingbird flickered. "I don't know how to be 11 years old," Harry said. "I know." Croaker picked up one of the face-down books beside Harry, a dense, handwritten text on the theoretical properties of untethered consciousness, and set it gently the right way up. "That's also part of the objective." The Department of Mysteries was not one place. This was the first thing Harry would have corrected anyone who'd claimed to know anything about it, not that many people did. It was a collection of chambers, some permanent, some shifting, organized around the study of forces that the magical world had chosen to investigate rather than explain away. Love. Death. Time. Space. Thought. Prophecy. Each room was its own ecosystem, with its own protocols, its own hazards, its own particular species of strangeness. Harry had grown up moving between them the way other children moved between rooms in a house, which meant he had an extremely unusual relationship with the concept of normal. He had his own space, not a bedroom, exactly, but a chamber off the corridor between the time room and the Hall of Prophecy that had been converted for him when he was small enough that Croaker had needed to carry him. It had a bed, a desk, shelves that covered every wall from floor to ceiling, and a single photograph on the desk that Harry rarely looked at directly. In the photograph, a woman with red hair and bright green eyes laughed at something off camera, and a man with dark untidy hair nudged her shoulder and grinned, and between them, held aloft in the woman's arms, was a baby who was already reaching for something out of frame with an expression of focused, total determination. Harry's first memory was not this photograph. His first memory was unspeakable Okonkwo's voice explaining what a pensive was, and why they were not to be touched without supervision. His second memory was Croaker setting him down in the love chamber and telling him, very quietly, that the warmth he felt was real, but so was the danger, and that the difference between them was something Harry would spend his life learning to navigate. His third memory was the veil. He didn't think about the veil often. Not because it frightened him, he was past the age of being frightened by the obvious, but because thinking about it too directly felt like staring at something that didn't want to be seen straight on. The archway stood in the death chamber on its dais, and the thin black curtain stirred even when there was no air to move it, and sometimes, if the department was very quiet at the right hour, you could hear things from the other side that weren't quite voices and weren't quite silence. Harry had sat in the death chamber more times than he could count, for meditation exercises, for training, for the simple fact that he found it easier to think there than almost anywhere else. Croaker had once told him that said something important about his character. Harry had asked what, exactly. Croaker had said he'd figure it out eventually. He spent the remaining days before September differently than he'd spent any period before them, which was to say that he began to actually think about what he was walking into rather than simply filing it under future problem. He pulled everything he had on Hogwarts, which was considerable, because the department kept records of everything, including 3 decades of incident reports from the castle that made for extremely educational reading, and he worked through it with the same systematic attention he gave to everything else. The castle itself was layered with magic old enough that it had stopped behaving like magic and started behaving like geology. The wards were some of the oldest in Britain. The moving staircases were partially sentient, in the way that very old things sometimes accrued a kind of accumulated intention. The portraits contained genuine consciousness fragments, not mere recorded impressions, which was a distinction most wizards didn't think to make. The ghosts were more complex than most ghost literature accounted for. The Forbidden Forest was genuinely dangerous in ways that the school treated with a casualness Harry found professionally alarming. Dumbledore was the headmaster. This Harry had known his entire life, in the distant way he knew most facts about the world above, abstractly, filed, not yet personal. He had a more complex relationship with Dumbledore in the abstract than with almost any other figure in his history, because Croaker had never been fully straightforward about the man, which in itself was information. Croaker was straightforward about almost everything. The places where he wasn't were always the places that mattered. What Harry knew, Dumbledore had been present on the night his parents died. Dumbledore had made decisions about Harry's placement, and those decisions had landed Harry here. Dumbledore was considered the greatest living wizard and had not visited the Department of Mysteries in 11 years. What Harry suspected, that the space between those facts was a conversation he and the old man were eventually going to have, and that it was going to be interesting. He was not afraid of the conversation. He was not, genuinely, afraid of Dumbledore. He had been raised by people who understood power in its most elemental forms, who had held time in their hands and touched the edge of death and mapped the geometry of human love, and he had absorbed their particular understanding that power was only frightening if you didn't know what it was made of. Dumbledore was made of choices, same as anyone else. Harry planned to understand them. He packed a trunk. This took an embarrassingly long time because Harry had no real framework for what school-appropriate possessions looked like, and the list Hogwarts sent was simultaneously too prescriptive and not nearly specific enough. He packed his books, not the school books, which were fine as introductory texts, but his actual books, the ones from his shelves, and then Croaker looked at the trunk and said, very gently, that he was perhaps over-indexing on the academic and under-indexing on the personal. Harry asked what the personal looked like. Croaker thought for a moment, then produced a chess set from somewhere and put it in the trunk without comment. Harry looked at it. "That's yours. You've beaten me 11 times in the last 2 months, Croaker said. You need better competition." A pause. "And you need something that's yours, not the department's." Harry thought about arguing. He didn't. The photograph from his desk made it into the trunk at the last minute, tucked between two books, not something he examined too closely as a decision. September 1st arrived the way significant days usually did, which was by being completely indistinguishable from the previous night until Harry opened his eyes and it was simply there. He lay in his bed in the department for what he knew would be the last time for a long while, listening to the sounds he'd grown up with, the distant hum of the bell jars, the almost voices from the Vale, the particular ambient silence of underground stone, and let himself do something he rarely permitted, which was to feel the moment without immediately analyzing it. It felt like standing at the edge of the time room, when the light was that deep impossible gold, and knowing something was about to shift. He got up, dressed, and found Okonkwo and Blythe and 3 other unspeakables he'd grown up working beside all somehow congregated in the corridor outside his chamber, which was not a coincidence because nothing in the department was ever coincidence. They were not sentimental people. They were people who had spent their careers handling forces that had broken lesser minds, and sentiment was not in the professional vocabulary. But they were there, which said more than sentiment could have. Okonkwo was a tall, spare woman from Lagos who had been the one to teach Harry Legilimency, or rather, she had been the one to discover that Harry had been doing a rough version of it instinctively since approximately age 6, and had elected to teach him to do it properly before he damaged himself. She looked at him now with the expression she usually reserved for particularly clean solutions to theoretical problems. "Don't let them bore you," she said. "I'll try. If anyone's shields are interesting, study them. Don't break them without cause. Obviously. Not obviously. You find loose threads annoying. I know you." Harry almost smiled. "I'll behave." Blythe, who was younger and had been Harry's primary sparring partner for 3 years, shoved a small package into his hands without ceremony. Harry opened it. It was a compass, not a directional compass but a magical one, calibrated to something other than north, its needle made of what looked like bone. "What does it point to?" Harry asked. "Nearest source of significant ambient magic. So in Hogwarts it'll be useless, too much noise." Blythe shrugged. "But outside the castle. In the forest. If you're in trouble and need to know what's there before you walk into it." Harry turned the compass over in his hands. "Thank you. Don't be weird about it." "I'm not being weird. You're doing the thing where you look at it like you're going to file it under emotional data." "That's just my face." Blythe pointed at him. "Work on that." The remaining unspeakables were mostly silent, which was standard, but they'd shown up, which was the point. Croaker was waiting at the end of the corridor with Harry's trunk already levitated beside him, and when Harry reached him, the old man looked at him for a moment with an expression Harry had learned to read over 11 years, assessing, satisfied, and underneath both of those, something that didn't have a professional name. "Ready?" Croaker asked. Harry picked up his trunk. "Define ready." "In this context I mean as a synonym for let's go." "Then yes." They walked up through the ministry together, through the corridors Harry had walked hundreds of times on errands and exercises and training rotations, past the gilded lifts and the great atrium with its fountain, past the ordinary ministry workers who moved aside automatically for Croaker the way people moved aside for things they didn't quite understand. Harry had been in this building his whole life and he'd never once been looked at the way the people up here sometimes glanced at him, quick, uncertain, the look people gave things that were slightly wrong in ways they couldn't articulate. He was used to it. It didn't bother him in any way he'd name aloud. Outside, London was September, cool and enormous and loud in a way that Harry always needed a moment to adjust to. He'd been outside before, on exercises, on carefully structured outings, but it still hit him every time, the sheer volume of a city, the sensory density of a world above ground, light and weather and the smell of something frying from a cart down the street and a dozen conversations happening within earshot and none of them about anything that mattered very much. He catalogued it and put it aside. They had a train to catch. King's Cross was the most aggressively ordinary place Harry had ever stood, and he'd spent time in the Muggle world enough to understand that ordinary was its own kind of camouflage. Croker walked him to the barrier between platforms 9 and 10 with the air of a man who had done this particular walk before and found it faintly below his professional dignity, but was doing it anyway. "Trolley," Harry said, looking at the barrier. "Walk directly at it. The platform is on the other side. I know how platform 9 3/4 works. I know you know. I'm saying it because," Croker paused very slightly. "Because it seems like the sort of thing someone should say." He looked at Harry. "Go on, then." Harry walked at the barrier, through the cold rush of magic that always lived in threshold enchantments, and came out the other side into the noise and steam of platform 9 3/4, and stopped. He had expected magic. He had not expected this. The Hogwarts Express was red and enormous and completely impractical and somehow deeply, inarguably right in a way Harry wasn't prepared for, not for the aesthetic correctness of it, the way it sat there belching friendly steam into the September air like something out of a childhood story, which it was, for most of the children flooding the platform around him. Families everywhere, parents with trolleys, owls in cages, cats attempting escape, children in robes calling to each other across the platform with the ease of people who had done this before or were doing it with the contagious excitement of people who hadn't. Someone's toad was loose. Someone else was crying, just slightly, at the window of a compartment, and a woman on the platform was waving up at her with an expression of such naked, specific parental love that Harry looked away before he could examine it too closely. Croker had come through behind him. "It's busy," Harry said. This was not a profound observation, but it was honest. "It is." Croker looked around with the detached assessment of a man taking inventory. "Find a compartment early. They fill quickly." A pause. "Try to share." Harry turned to look at him. "Try to share. With people. The compartment. Rather than sitting alone." I understood the implication. Croker made a small sound that on anyone else might have been a laugh. He reached out and straightened the collar of Harry's robe, a very small, very deliberate gesture, and then stepped back with his hands clasped behind him and his face arranged back into its professional configuration. "The objective," he said quietly, "is Hogwarts. Learn what you can. Understand the environment. But also," he stopped. Considered. "Also just see what happens. You've been trained for most things, Harry. But not for this. So see what happens." Harry looked at him. "That's the least prescriptive thing you've ever said to me." "Yes," Croker agreed. "It is." Harry picked up his trunk. He was halfway down the platform before he stopped and turned back, because something made him, some instinct that bypassed the training. "Croker." The old man looked at him. "You'll be there." "If something," Harry stopped. Rewound. "If I need to reach the department." "You know how," Croker said. "You've always known how." Harry nodded. Turned back toward the train. Found a compartment near the back, second from the end, relatively empty. One red-haired boy was already sprawled across one of the seats, staring at the ceiling with the boneless exhaustion of someone who had endured an enormous morning and not yet recovered. He didn't look up when Harry opened the door. Harry put his trunk in the overhead rack with controlled precision, sat down opposite the window, and pulled out a book. Not one of the school books. One of his own, a slim volume on the theoretical geometry of magical consciousness, water-stained at the corner from an incident in the thought chamber 2 years ago. He opened it to where he'd left off. The red-haired boy eventually noticed him and sat up. "Oh. Hiya." He had freckles and a slightly overwhelmed expression. "Ron Weasley." Harry looked up. "Harry Potter." Ron Weasley's eyes went, involuntarily, to Harry's forehead. His mouth opened slightly. Harry waited. "Sorry," Ron said, with the honesty of someone who hadn't quite managed to stop himself. "It's just, everyone says, I mean, my mum," he stopped himself. Made a visible effort at composure. "Air. Right. Have you got anything to eat?" The trolley doesn't come for a while and I've already gone through my sandwiches. Harry looked at him for a moment. Then he reached into his bag, produced a wrapped piece of shortbread that Okonkwo had pressed into his hand that morning with the expression of someone doing something slightly embarrassing, and held it out. Ron took it. Cheers. He bit into it. What's that you're reading? Theoretical Geometry of Magical Consciousness. Ron chewed. Looked at the cover. Looked at Harry. Is that a first-year book? No. Right. Ron nodded slowly. Is it good? It's interesting. Whether it's good depends on whether you find questions more satisfying than answers. Ron seemed to absorb this. I don't, personally. Fair, Harry said, and almost meant it as a compliment, because there was something refreshingly straightforward about a person who knew what they liked. The compartment door opened again, and a girl with large front teeth and a great quantity of bushy brown hair leaned in with the confident air of someone who was certain they were doing the right thing. Has anyone seen a toad? A boy named Neville's lost his. No toad, Ron said. The girl's eyes moved to Harry. Paused. Harry watched her do the same calculation Ron had done, the forehead, the scar, the filing of information, but her recovery was faster and she moved past it to something more interesting almost immediately, which Harry registered with a small increase in attention. You're Harry Potter, she said, not as an exclamation but as a fact she was confirming. Yes. I'm Hermione Granger. I've read about you, of course, well, not you, specifically, since there isn't much written about you that's accurate, but the historical context. The Knight Voldemort, she paused, noted that both Harry and Ron were watching her without any of the flinching she'd apparently expected at the name, and continued smoothly, the Knight Voldemort fell. The implications for the magical theory of sacrificial protection are fascinating. Though most of the texts are rather speculative. She looked at the book in Harry's hand. Is that Threnodi's Geometric Models of Consciousness? The second edition? Harry looked at the cover. Third. She blinked. There's a third edition. It's not publicly circulated. How did you? She stopped. Something shifted in her expression, not less curious, but more focused. Where exactly did you grow up? Somewhere that had a good library, Harry said. She looked at him for another moment with the expression of someone filing something away for later examination. I'll help Neville find his toad, she said, and withdrew from the compartment, pulling the door shut behind her. Ron watched the door. She's a lot, he said. She's quick, Harry said. That's different. Ron seemed to decide not to argue this. He ate the rest of the shortbread. Hogwarts came up out of the dark with all its towers and lit windows reflecting on the Black Lake, and Harry stood in one of the boats with the other first-years and let himself look at it properly for the first time without immediately converting the looking into analysis. It was, straightforwardly and without qualification, extraordinary. Not because of the magic in the stones, though that was considerable, or the age of the place, which he could feel from here as a kind of deep bass hum under everything. It was extraordinary because it was real in a way that the records hadn't prepared him for, the way the light from the windows fell on the water, the way the towers were unevenly lit at different heights, the way the forest at the edge of the grounds was dark in a way that wasn't merely lack of light but felt inhabited. Neville Longbottom was in the same boat. He was a round-faced boy who had the particular posture of someone who had spent a long time waiting to be told they'd gotten something wrong, and he was gripping the side of the boat with both hands less because of the water and more, Harry suspected, out of general principle. His toad had been recovered. He was holding it now in cupped hands with the tenderness of someone who understood that the things you loved were the things that escaped. It's big, Neville said quietly, looking at the castle. Yes, Harry agreed. Have you been before? No. But I've read about it. Neville looked at him sideways. What's it like in the reading? Does it seem friendly? Harry considered this honestly. It's old enough that it has its own intentions, he said. That's not the same as friendly or unfriendly. It's more like, the castle decides whether it likes you, separately from whether the people in it do. Neville was quiet for a moment. Then, I hope it likes me. Harry looked at him. There was something in that statement, the simplicity of it, the genuine hope, that was different from the way most people talked about themselves. Not self-pitying. Just honest. I think it probably will, Harry said. He didn't say things like that to be kind. He said them when he meant them. Neville looked slightly less like he was waiting for something to go wrong. The boats touched the bank. The Great Hall was genuinely impressive, and Harry gave it one moment of genuine appreciation before cataloguing it, the bewitched ceiling currently showing a clear September sky dense with stars, which was technically a replication charm laid over the stone ceiling, a permanent installation that updated to reflect real atmospheric conditions, enchanted initially by the founders and maintained since by the resident charms professor, and several wards built into the castle itself. The 4 long tables. The students already seated. The staff table, where Harry located Dumbledore immediately by the silver beard and the particular quality of presence that very powerful wizards sometimes had, not an aura, exactly, but a weight, the way very dense objects affected the space around them. Dumbledore was looking at the incoming first years with an expression of genial benevolence. His gaze moved through the line with the comfortable familiarity of a man who had done this many times. When it reached Harry, it stopped. Harry met his eyes. The look that moved through Dumbledore's face was brief and complex and would have been invisible to most people, a flicker of something that was not quite surprise and not quite relief and not quite grief, but occupied a space where those 3 things intersected. His expression recomposed itself within a second. But Harry had been trained by the woman who'd written half the canonical literature on Legilimency, and a second was more than enough. He filed it away. The sorting hat was brought out on a stool. Harry had read about it, but reading about a 1,000-year-old intelligence that lived in a piece of fabric did not fully prepare you for the experience of seeing it, which was that it looked exactly like a very old hat and then opened what was apparently a mouth and began to sing, which was somehow more dissonant than the idea of a talking hat had been in his imagination. The song was clever, actually. He acknowledged that. Good internal rhyme scheme, and the historical content was compressed efficiently. Granger, Hermione. Hermione walked to the stool with the air of someone who had prepared for this and was not going to be undone by nerves. The hat went on her head and paused for barely 5 seconds before it called out, "Gryffindor," with what seemed like genuine enthusiasm. Hermione walked to the Gryffindor table with her shoulders back and her chin up and the expression of someone who had suspected this result and was glad to have it confirmed. Names moved through the alphabet. Harry watched. He watched the hat, specifically, the way it sat differently on different heads, the way it seemed to have actual conversations with some students and quick determinations with others. He watched the students react to their sortings, the relief and the delight and the occasional disappointment that people tried to hide and couldn't, not from someone paying proper attention. Longbottom, Neville nearly tripped walking to the stool. The hat sat on his head for almost a minute, long enough that the hall had begun to shift with the restlessness of an audience that had expected a quicker resolution, and then, with what felt like a decision hard won from something, called Gryffindor. Neville slid off the stool with an expression of pure, uncomplicated relief. Harry noted it. Potter, Harry. The hall went from restless to silent. A specific quality of silence, not emptiness but held breath, the kind that happens when something everyone has been thinking about has finally been said aloud. Harry walked to the stool and sat down, and the hat dropped over his eyes and the world went briefly dark. Then the hat said, in a voice that only he could hear, "Well." "Hello," Harry thought back, because there seemed no reason not to acknowledge it. "A Legilimens," the hat said, with what sounded like interest. "At 11. That's uncommon. You've been somewhere unusual." "Yes. I can see, quite a lot, actually. You're letting me. I'm not stopping you. Most people try to direct me. You're just, open." "I already know where you're going to put me," Harry said. "I'm curious how you decide." There was a pause that felt like genuine consideration. What makes you think you know? Because the qualities you sort for are, in order, courage, intelligence, ambition, and loyalty. I have all four in sufficient quantity that the sorting would come down to which is most dominant under pressure. The answer to that question is situational rather than fixed. Harry paused. Which means you'll pick the house that best serves the objective. And what is the objective? That's what I'm here to find out. The hat made a sound that was not quite laughter but lived next door to it. You know, in 900 years, I don't think a first year has ever framed it quite like that. I'd imagine not. A pause. Then, you could be great, you know. Any house would be, I know. Gryffindor, then, the hat said, with the air of something committing to a choice it found interesting. Since you're apparently here to find out what happens when you're somewhere unexpected. Harry pulled the hat off himself and set it back on the stool before the hat had finished shouting, which he suspected was slightly rude but efficient, and walked to the Gryffindor table to the kind of applause that had an edge of bewilderment to it, people who weren't sure if they were celebrating or just reacting. He sat down. Hermione Granger was 3 seats down and watching him with an expression he was beginning to recognize as her version of heightened interest. Neville Longbottom was across from him, and he smiled, the expression uncomplicated and genuine. "We're in the same house," Neville said, as if this were specifically good news. "We are," Harry agreed. For some reason he didn't examine, it felt like it was. The feast materialized on the tables, which was a very good practical demonstration of non-verbal, wandless large-scale food transfiguration, and Harry ate and watched the hall and catalogued everything with the ease of habit. He catalogued the staff table, Quirrell, the defense professor, who had a turban and a nervous quality that didn't match his academic record, which Harry had pulled from the ministry files before leaving, Professor McGonagall, who had the posture of someone accustomed to being the most competent person in most rooms, Snape, the potions professor, who looked at Harry once with an expression Harry couldn't immediately decode and looked away. He catalogued the Slytherin table, a blonde boy named Malfoy who tried to introduce himself on the platform with a handshake that was meant to establish hierarchy before the sentence was finished, and whom Harry had declined with a politeness so precise it left no room for offense. He catalogued the other tables, the other students, the geography of social dynamics already forming in the first hour of term. He looked once more at the staff table, and Dumbledore was watching him again with those half-moon glasses and that expression Harry had noted before, that complex, layered thing that resolved into something that looked like careful hope. Harry looked back at his plate. The turban, he thought, circling back to Quirrell. The turban was wrong. Not aesthetically, he had no opinion on turbans as objects. But the magical signature around it was wrong in a way that Harry's particular upbringing had given him the vocabulary to name and most wizards his age did not. It had the quality of a container. Something sealed. Something that wanted to be in 2 places at once. He would think about that more carefully later. He filed it, picked up his fork, and ate his dinner in the Great Hall of Hogwarts, surrounded by 300 students who would spend the next several years learning that the boy who lived was not quite what they'd been expecting. He was not afraid of what was coming. He was paying attention. Which, in Harry's experience, was the same thing. Later, much later, when the feast was over and the students were being led to their dormitories and the candles were guttering down in the Great Hall, Dumbledore sat at the high table with his hands folded and looked at the space where Harry Potter had sat for 3 hours and said nothing, and done everything. He was 11 years old, and he had watched the room the way Alastor Moody watched rooms. He had eaten his dinner with the economy of someone who treated meals as fuel. He had spoken to the round-faced boy beside him in quiet, direct sentences. He had not once looked uncertain. Dumbledore thought of a baby in a basket on a doorstep. He thought of an owl he'd nearly sent 11 years ago. He thought of a choice that had seemed, at the time, like the only choice, and that now sat in his chest like the specific weight of things that can't be undone. The boy he'd placed in the Department of Mysteries had come back as something Dumbledore did not fully have a name for. He would need to learn one. He took a sherbet lemon from his pocket, unwrapped it, and sat in the empty hall a while longer. Chapter 2, The weight of names. The dormitory smelled like stone and candle wax and someone's mother's cooking, faint on a jacket thrown over a bedpost, and Harry lay on his back in the dark and listened to 4 other boys breathe themselves into sleep. Ron Weasley went first, with the thoroughness of someone who'd been awake since before dawn. Seamus Finnegan took longer, muttering something Irish and half-formed before dropping off mid-word. Dean Thomas rolled over twice, found his position, stayed there. Neville Longbottom was the last, and he didn't so much fall asleep as gradually stop being anxious. The quality of his breathing changed increment by increment until it finally smoothed out, and Harry, who had been tracking it without meaning to, registered the change and was satisfied. He stared at the canopy above his bed. The castle moved around him, not loudly, but perceptibly. If you were the kind of person who listened for the weight of old stone settling, the distant negotiation of shifting staircases, the faint harmonic that lived in the walls where magic had been done so many times for so many centuries that it had soaked into the rock itself. He found it almost familiar, the way a new language with shared roots felt almost familiar. Not home, but cognate with home. His trunk was at the foot of the bed. The photograph was inside it, between 2 books, and he didn't think about it. At 2:30 he got up, dressed in silence, and went to look at the castle. It was different at night. Obviously, any place was different at night, but Hogwarts at night was different in a way that felt like the castle's actual personality emerging once the performance of daytime was over. The corridors were lit by torches that burned low and blue-orange, throwing long shadows across portraits whose occupants were mostly asleep in their frames, though occasionally one cracked an eye at Harry as he passed and decided not to comment. The staircases moved with a sluggish deliberateness, as if less interested in showing off without an audience. The stones were cold and the echo of his footsteps was the only human sound. He wasn't sneaking. He wasn't trying to be invisible. He simply moved with the quality of attention that the department had trained into him, economical, present, not announcing itself. If a professor had walked around a corner, Harry would have stopped and explained himself clearly and without embarrassment. He was not doing anything wrong. He was orienting. He found the defense classroom first, because he'd mapped the castle's floor plan from the records and wanted to check the map against the reality. The door was unlocked. He put his hand on it and felt the magical signature of the room, chalk dust and something sharper underneath, an astringency that didn't belong to any casting residue he recognized from normal defensive work. He didn't open the door. The turban problem was going to need direct observation. He noted the classroom as a future data point and moved on. The restricted section of the library was exactly as restricted as advertised, which was to say the barrier around it was functional but not sophisticated, a repelling charm layered with a mild compulsion to feel guilty, which Harry had to consciously step through rather than around. The books themselves were interesting, several on necromancy, bound in materials he recognized, 2 on blood magic, a collection of texts on possession and consciousness transfer that he pulled from the shelf and paged through standing in the dark with no light source, which he didn't need, having learned to read by wandlight at age 7 and having extended that particular skill into areas the curriculum hadn't specifically required. He found what he was looking for in the 3rd book, under a chapter heading that had been partially obscured by a preservation charm, a section on consciousness anchoring, on the specific magical signature of a mind that had survived circumstances that should have destroyed it, on the way such a mind might seek a new vessel while maintaining its essential pattern. He read it twice. Replaced the book. Stood in the dark for a moment. Then he went to find the 3rd floor corridor. The locked door on the 3rd floor was the least subtle piece of security Harry had encountered since leaving the department, which was saying something given that the department housed objects capable of unraveling the fabric of spacetime. There was a door. The door was locked. A first-year class had been told explicitly to stay away from it. This was an announcement, not a deterrent. Whoever had set this up was either confident that the lock was sufficient, which Harry doubted, or wanted the door noticed while maintaining plausible institutional deniability, which was more interesting. The lock itself was a standard Alohomora-resistant charm, well cast but not imaginative. Harry stood in front of it for approximately 6 seconds, feeling the structure of the ward, and then bypassed it by targeting the door's hinge mechanism rather than its locking spell, which technically meant the door swung open and the lock was never violated at all. Inside, three-headed dog, enormous, asleep on the floor above a trapdoor. The dog smelled strongly of dog and something else, a calming draft in its water, he suspected, given the quality of its sleep. It was breathing in an irregular three-part rhythm because it had three heads and they weren't fully synchronized, which was an interesting biological detail. The trapdoor beneath it was the real object of interest, and Harry looked at it long enough to confirm it was there, that it had a magical signature below it that spoke of layers, something growing, something temporal, something reflective, and then he stepped back out, pulled the door closed, and re-engaged the latch. Whatever Dumbledore was hiding down there, he was hiding it deliberately and on a timeline. Which meant the mystery was managed, not accidental. Which meant there was something specific he was waiting for. Harry filed this beside the Quirrell problem and the Dumbledore problem, which were possibly the same problem, and went back to the dormitory before 5 a.m. He was asleep by the time Ron Weasley started loudly discovering that his alarm clock had been set for 6 instead of 7 and that this was apparently a catastrophe. Classes were interesting. Not in the way he'd expected, which was that he'd anticipated being bored by the material and had prepared himself for the exercise of patience. He was bored by some of the material, but the experience of being in a classroom was not the same as the material, and he hadn't accounted for that properly. Charms was first, with Professor Flitwick, who was approximately the height of one of the taller pieces of furniture and had a voice like a bell in a strong wind. He introduced the lesson with an energy that was not performative. He genuinely loved this, which Harry respected, because genuine enthusiasm was rarer and more valuable than most people gave it credit for. The spell they were learning was Wingardium Leviosa, a basic levitation charm, first principle in kinetic spellwork. Harry had cast it, or a variant of it, when he was 8. He picked up his wand, performed the prescribed movement, said the incantation at the appropriate register, and levitated the feather. Flitwick looked at him. Then at the feather. Then at the notes on his desk, and Harry could see him doing a rapid recalibration. "Excellent, Mr. Potter," Flitwick said carefully. "Perhaps a bit less wrist on the upswing." "The wrist doesn't affect the outcome at this basic a level," Harry said, not dismissively but as a factual observation, and then immediately saw from Flitwick's expression that this was the kind of statement that landed differently in a classroom than it did in the time room, and added, "I mean, the way you've described it makes sense for building correct form in more complex charms. That's a good pedagogical reason for the emphasis." Flitwick's expression shifted from mildly taken aback to genuinely curious. "Where did you study prior to Hogwarts, Mr. Potter?" "Privately," Harry said. Flitwick looked at him for another moment, then moved on, but Harry caught the note the professor made in the margin of his register. 2 words, underlined. He didn't try to read them from this distance. That would have been rude. Hermione Granger was 2 seats to his left, and she had also levitated her feather early, and she looked at Harry's early success with the expression of someone who had expected to be first and was recalibrating her competition assessment. Harry acknowledged her feather with a slight nod, which she received with a slight nod back, and they had what was functionally a very efficient conversation without speaking. Ron Weasley had not yet successfully levitated anything and was making the wand movement with increasing violence, as if force might compensate for finesse. His feather blew sideways, then spun, then collapsed. He muttered something under his breath that was probably not the correct incantation. Harry reached over and adjusted the angle of Ron's wrist without asking. Ron blinked. The feather rose 6 inches, hovered, and came down gently. "Oh," Ron said. "Ha." He tried it again. The feather went up properly this time, unhurried. "Cheers." "The movement wants to be light," Harry said. "Not precise." "Light." Ron nodded as if this were wisdom, which it was, actually, just the sort of practical wisdom that was easy to miss when you were thinking too hard. Transfiguration was Professor McGonagall, who began by spending 10 minutes as a cat, sitting on her desk and watching first years file in with the evaluative patience of someone determining quality before deciding how to proceed. Harry had sat down and opened his notebook and was writing before she transformed, because he'd noticed the cat when he came in and had a suspicion. When she flowed back into human form, he kept writing, because the sight was worth documenting. McGonagall noticed. "Mr. Potter. You seem unsurprised." "I recognized the animagus register signature," Harry said. "The stillness is distinctive. Registered animagi maintain a particular quality of aware stillness that unregistered ones don't because they're more practiced at human concealment. You're registered, which means you're comfortable." He paused. "It's a beautiful transformation. The form must be very well established." McGonagall looked at him for a moment that was almost as long as the hat's pause the previous night. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was precisely neutral, which was itself an expression, and she moved on with the lesson. But she watched him throughout the class with the focused interest of someone reassessing a situation they thought they'd understood. The practical work was converting a match to a needle. Theoretical underpinning, form follows function in transfiguration, the object's purpose being as important as its physical properties in directing the transformation. Harry had the needle on his second attempt. His first produced something that was neither match nor needle but an interesting intermediate state he spent a moment studying before correcting it. McGonagall came over to look at the intermediate. "What happened here?" she asked. "The form wanted to split the difference," Harry said. "I was thinking about both ends simultaneously rather than directing toward the target. It's an attention problem." He held up the completed needle. "Corrected." McGonagall picked up the intermediate, still hovering between match and needle, its properties genuinely ambiguous, and looked at it carefully. "This is going to end up in an essay question," she said, mostly to herself. Harry thought she might have been pleased, actually. The thing about being in a school was that it wasn't about the classes. Harry had understood this intellectually before arriving and was now understanding it in the more complicated way you understood things when they were happening to you rather than being abstracted. The classes were the structure the day hung on. The actual content of the day was everything between and around them, the dynamics of the common room, the alliances forming over breakfast, the specific social architecture of a community that had been interrupted by summer and was re-establishing itself around a new cohort. The first years were being evaluated and evaluating simultaneously, with the earnestness of people who hadn't yet learned to pretend they weren't doing it. Harry watched all of it. He was not, he would have said, a person who needed community. He had grown up with the Unspeakables, who were not a social group in any conventional sense but who had their own language and loyalty and shared vocabulary of experience. He understood connection as a practical thing, a resource, a web of mutual utility and, in its better forms, genuine regard. He did not pine for friends the way the books he'd read about boarding schools suggested children were supposed to. But watching the common room that first evening, Seamus and Dean already in the middle of an argument about Quidditch that was going to either cement a friendship or destroy one, Ron Weasley teaching Neville a card game with the patient generosity of someone who'd grown up in a house full of siblings, other students finding each other in the specific way people found each other when they were all slightly unmoored. Harry sat in the corner with a book and thought that the department, for all it had given him, had not had this. Whatever this was. Hermione came and sat next to him, not across from him or at a careful distance, but directly adjacent, pulling her own book out with the self-sufficiency of someone who wanted company without wanting conversation. Which was either coincidence or a very precise social read. Harry looked at the book she was reading. She was 2 chapters into a text on the theory of magical resistance. "The 3rd chapter contradicts the 2nd," he said, without looking up from his own book. "I know," she said. "I want to see if the author knows." A pause. "Does he?" Harry asked. "Not yet," she said. "I'll let you know." They read in parallel silence for 40 minutes, which was one of the more comfortable silences Harry had experienced in his first 24 hours at Hogwarts. Neville Longbottom found Harry in the dormitory before dinner on the 3rd day, sitting cross-legged on his bed with 3 books open and a piece of parchment he'd been mapping something on, the overlap between what he'd read in the restricted section and what he was beginning to observe about Quirrell in class. Neville looked at the parchment. That's a lot of circles. Mind map, Harry said. Sit down if you want. Neville sat on the end of his own bed, which was close enough to count as company. He had Trevor the Toad in his hands again and was doing the thing with him, not stroking, exactly, but a kind of gentle containment that seemed more about Neville's hands needing something to do than about the toad. He was quiet for a moment. Harry recognized the quality of quiet as someone working up to something. Can I ask you something? Neville said. Yes. It's a bit, I don't want it to come out weird. Ask it. Neville looked at the toad. What's it like? Having, the scar, and everything. Being, everyone knows who you are. Harry set his quill down. He considered the question, because it was a genuine question and Neville had asked it without the prurient curiosity that most people couldn't quite suppress, and he thought about what the honest answer was. I didn't know anyone knew who I was until I was about 7, he said. Down where I grew up, it wasn't the point of me. I was just someone they were teaching things to. He paused. So I don't really feel the weight of it. It's like someone telling you there's a painting of you somewhere that everyone's seen, you know it intellectually but it doesn't quite feel like you. Neville thought about this. Where did you grow up? If that's okay to ask. Underground, Harry said. Neville blinked. Underground. Ministry of Magic. Department of Mysteries. Neville's expression went through several things. Is that where they study the death? Time. Space. Love. Yes. And you just lived there. It was home, Harry said. Straightforwardly. Neville was quiet for another moment. Then, that sounds like it was either amazing or horrible. Mostly amazing, Harry said. Some horrible. Same as anywhere, probably. Neville nodded slowly. He looked down at the toad. My parents are in St. Mungo's, he said, with the directness of someone who decided to match Harry's honesty for honesty. They've been there since I was a baby. Bellatrix Lestrange and some others tortured them. They don't really know who I am anymore. Harry was quiet. Not uncomfortably, not the silence of someone who didn't know what to say, but the silence of someone who understood that some things didn't need a response, just a witness. Gran says I should be proud of them, Neville continued. I am. But mostly sometimes I just want my mum. He stopped. Looked slightly mortified by what had come out of him. Harry looked at the photograph tucked between his books in the open trunk. He didn't look at it directly. The people who taught me, Harry said, they're good at a lot of things. But he stopped, found the word. There's a shape to what they couldn't give me. I don't look at it much. But it's there. Neville looked at him. Something in his expression settled. Yeah, he said quietly. That's exactly it. They sat in companionable silence until Ron came thundering up the stairs demanding to know if either of them wanted to go to dinner, because apparently the roast was on Thursdays and Ron had very specific feelings about missing the roast. Harry closed his books, capped his ink, and went to dinner. History of Magic was taught by a ghost, which was an institutional choice Harry had thoughts about. Professor Binns had died at his desk some decades ago and apparently declined to let this stop him, which was either admirable or indicative of a problematic relationship with mortality. He taught the class in a drone that had the exact frequency required to make the human brain gradually disengage from conscious processing, which Harry resisted through sheer bloody-mindedness and the practice of writing things down. He sat next to Hermione, because they had developed an unofficial arrangement in most classes where they sat near each other by mutual unspoken agreement. She had given up on the idea that he would follow along with the textbook page by page and had given up on being surprised when he asked Binns questions that derailed the lesson, though she never looked displeased when it happened. She was the only person in the class who kept up with his digressions, and occasionally pushed them further. Today, Harry had asked about the Goblin rebellions in a way that reframed the question of who had actually initiated the conflict, using the primary source analysis he'd done in the department's archive the previous summer. Binns had stopped. Looked at him, or through him, it was slightly hard to tell with ghosts. And said that primary source analysis was beyond the scope of the first-year curriculum. I know, Harry said. But is the reframe wrong? A pause that had the distinct quality of a ghost reconsidering an argument it had been making for 40 years. No, Binns admitted. It is not wrong. Hermione made a note. After class, in the corridor, she said, where do you get primary sources on goblin rebellions? The Department of Mysteries keeps archives of most significant magical historical events. Cross-referenced. You grew up in the Department of Mysteries, she said. It wasn't a question, she'd worked it out, he could tell, had been quietly assembling the evidence since the first day. That's why you know things that aren't in any of the textbooks. Yes. She stopped walking. Can you read the restricted sources? Down there? Most of them. Since when? Since I was old enough to be trusted with them. He kept walking. She fell back into step beside him without breaking stride. You're going to ask me if I'll tell you what's in them. I was going to ask if you'd recommend a reading order, she corrected. I have the list of what's available in the restricted section here. I want to know which ones are actually worth the detention risk. Harry looked at her. She had her notebook out already, quill ready, looking at him with the focused patience of someone who had identified the most efficient source of information and was not going to waste the opportunity by being coy about it. Fine, he said. He took her quill, rewrote her list with a priority order and marginal notes on 3 of them. Handed it back. She looked at the notes. What's the problem with the Barnabas text? The author's theory of consciousness transfer is 50 years out of date. The conclusions in Chapter 8 are built on a flawed model of soul division. Read the footnotes but ignore the framework. Soul division, she said, and the way she said it told him the phrase had flagged something in her own reading. That's in the chapter on Horcruxes in the Flamel text, isn't it? But only obliquely. Harry looked at her properly. You've read the Flamel text. I've read everything in the regular section, she said, slightly defensive. And borrowed 3 things from the restricted section already. The repelling charm is poorly maintained on the east shelf. I know, Harry said. I noticed the first night. They stared at each other for a moment with the mutual recognition of 2 people who have found someone operating at the same frequency, which was an experience Harry had not previously had with someone his own age. You should probably know, Hermione said carefully, that I think there's something wrong with Professor Quirrell. Harry didn't say anything. His hands shake in a specific pattern, she said. Not anxiety. More like something is trying to express itself through him and he's suppressing it. And his turban is a containment charm. I can't identify what it's containing, but the spellwork is layered in a way that defensive enchantments aren't usually. I know, Harry said. She stopped. You already know. I've been thinking about it since the sorting feast. What is it? She said. What's in the turban? Harry considered how much to say. Not because he didn't trust her, he was developing a reasonable model of Hermione Granger and untrustworthy was not among its features, but because naming it aloud in a corridor was a certain kind of commitment. I have a hypothesis, he said. I need more data before I say it out loud. She looked like she wanted to push. Chose not to. Fine. But when you have enough data, I'll tell you. She nodded. They walked to the next class. Potions was Snape. Harry had thought, in preparation, about Snape more than about most of the staff. The Ministry files on Severus Snape were interesting in the specific way that heavily redacted documents were interesting. The redactions told you as much as the content, and what remained told you that he was a man whose past had been actively managed rather than simply private. He had a conviction in the Death Eater trials that had been overturned on the testimony of Albus Dumbledore. He was the youngest person to apply for the defense against the dark arts position in the last 50 years. He had been given potions instead, repeatedly, and continued to apply for defense, which told you something about the persistence of a purpose. The classroom was cold by design. Most serious potions work required ambient stability, and cold was more controllable than warm. Snape swept in with the kind of entrance that was not theatrical but had a quality of settled authority that commanded attention more effectively than theatrics. He stood at the front of the room with his hands folded behind his back and looked at the first years with an expression of considered patience. "Mr. Potter," he said, before taking the register, before introducing himself. "Our new celebrity." Harry looked at him. He'd expected something like this, had, in fact, read Snape's particular style in the few accounts from former students available to him. He let the silence sit for a moment. "Professor," he said, evenly. Not deferential, not challenging. Just present. Something flickered in Snape's expression. It was very small. Harry suspected most people wouldn't have caught it. "Tell me," Snape said, with the precision of someone who had phrased this question to produce a specific outcome, "what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" "Draught of living death," Harry said. "It's considered amongst the most powerful soporific potions in existence. Asphodel is in the lily family. Wormwood has associations with bitterness and grief in both potion-making and divination contexts, though the latter is obviously less rigorous." He paused. "The combination is particularly efficient because the asphodel relaxes the base magical resistance of the target while the wormwood addresses the conscious will. Two different vectors for the same outcome." The classroom was very quiet. Snape looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was doing something complex and private behind the professionalism of his face. "Where would you look if I asked you to find a bezoar?" "In the stomach of a goat. It's an antidote to most poisons, though its efficacy varies with the age and diet of the goat and the specific poison in question. The Department of Mysteries keeps a stock of high-efficacy bezoars for cases involving unknown magical compounds." Something moved through Snape's face at Department of Mysteries. Just slightly. He moved on to the third question. "What is the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane?" "They're the same plant," Harry said. "Also called aconite. The naming difference is contextual, wolfsbane in pest and dark creature deterrence, monkshood in potion work proper, aconite in academic literature. Same plant, 3 names, each carrying the baggage of a different use tradition." Snape stood very still for a moment. "Clearly," he said, "some of us have come to Hogwarts with advantages over others." His voice was smooth and unreadable. "Fame is not always deserved." Harry looked at him. "I didn't get those answers from being famous," he said, without heat but without apology. "I got them from reading. Fame doesn't teach you anything. Books do." He heard Hermione, one seat to his right, inhale sharply. He heard Ron, behind him, make a sound that was trying not to be a laugh. Snape's eyes rested on him for another moment. They were very dark and very analytical, and Harry had the distinct sense that he was being evaluated by someone who had not decided yet what Harry was, which was itself an interesting piece of information. "Begin the potion on page 12, Snape said, and moved on. Harry brewed. He was precise and economic in his movements, and he didn't talk while he worked, which was also a department habit. Blythe had drilled silence during preparation into him for 3 years on the grounds that distraction was how you lost fingers. His potion was exactly the right shade at each stage, bubbled at the correct frequency, and smelled correct at the finish, which was a thing he verified, because he'd learned early that olfactory confirmation was often cleaner than visual in potions work. Snape came to stand behind him at the end of the lesson and looked at the potion for a long time without saying anything. Then, 7 out of 10. Harry looked at his cauldron. "What were the deductions?" "You heated too quickly in the 3rd stage." Harry thought back through his steps. He had, fractionally, pushed the temperature on the 3rd stage, not by much, not enough to affect the outcome, but technically outside the optimal range. "Yes," he said. "Fair." Snape looked at him. "You're not going to argue?" It was a fair deduction. A pause. Most students argue. Most students are wrong about their potions, Harry said. I wasn't wrong about the deduction. Arguing correct corrections is a waste of time. Snape's expression did the small, private, complex thing again. He said nothing further and moved to the next student. The week built on itself. Classes, meals, the common room at night, the castle gradually becoming known to him in the way that places you've read about became known when you finally walked through them, matching and mismatching with your mental map in ways that were interesting rather than disorienting. He ran into nearly headless Nick on his second night's wandering and they had a genuinely good conversation about the metaphysics of ghosthood that ended with Nick looking thoughtful in a way he suspected Nick didn't usually look. The moving staircases began, with what felt like a decision, to move less when Harry was on them, which he took as a form of approval. He went to see the third-floor corridor door again. Once a week, from a distance. Just to check. The signature below the trapdoor was consistent. Stable. Waiting. He found Dumbledore on his second Friday, not by accident. He had checked the headmaster's schedule and found a pattern, and had placed himself in the corridor outside the stone gargoyle at 7 in the evening when the pattern said Dumbledore would be returning from whatever he did on Friday evenings, which Harry suspected involved the third floor. Dumbledore came around the corner and stopped with the precise quality of surprise of someone who had not expected to be outmaneuvered by an 11-year-old. Harry stood with his hands in his robe pockets and looked at the most powerful wizard in Britain. "Mr. Potter," Dumbledore said. He sounded genuinely pleased, which was either authentic or the most sophisticated performed response Harry had encountered. "Professor Dumbledore," Harry said. "Do you have a moment?" Dumbledore tilted his head. "For you?" "Several." He gestured toward his office. "Shall we?" The office was everything the records hadn't prepared him for. The instruments, the portraits of past headmasters, the phoenix on the perch who looked at Harry with the bright, specific interest of a creature that recognized something. Fawkes, Harry had read about. He looked at the bird and the bird looked at him and he thought that they understood each other on some level that didn't require words. Dumbledore sat behind his desk with his long fingers laced together and waited with the patient intelligence of someone who knew that the person who spoke first in a negotiation had usually already lost something. Harry sat across from him and waited with the exact same patience. They looked at each other. It lasted, genuinely, nearly 30 seconds. Then Dumbledore smiled, and it was a real smile, surprised and delighted and slightly rueful. "You are," he said, "not remotely what I expected." "What did you expect?" Harry asked. "Someone more, uncertain," Dumbledore said honestly. "I expected someone who had been trained, yes. I knew Croker would be thorough. But I expected someone who would come into this place and feel the gap between his preparation and the reality." He looked at Harry with those blue eyes that were sharper than the half-moon glasses suggested. "You seem to have no such gap." "I have gaps," Harry said. "I'm working on cataloging them." Dumbledore's smile shifted slightly. "You came to find me," he said. "You would like to ask me something." "I'd like to ask you several things," Harry said. "But the most important is, what is under the trapdoor on the third floor, why is it here, and who is it here for?" Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. In the quiet, one of the portrait headmasters turned in their sleep, and Fawkes made a small sound. "That," Dumbledore said, "is not a question I expected quite so quickly." "No," Harry agreed. "I imagine not. But you brought something to the school, and you've made it discoverable, and that's a choice. I'd like to understand what the choice is in service of." Dumbledore looked at him for a long time. "What do you think it's in service of?" he asked. And it was not deflection, it was genuine curiosity about what Harry had worked out. "You're testing something," Harry said. "Or containing something. The signature below the trapdoor has multiple layers. I can feel at least 5 distinct categories of magical protection, and one of them is temporal, which means at least part of what's down there has time stability requirements. That rules out most standard containment protocols." He paused. I'm not going to go down there without your knowledge. I just want to know if we're on the same side. Dumbledore's expression settled into something that was not quite sorrow and not quite wonder but lived between them. And how would you determine that? He asked quietly. I'd ask you about my parents, Harry said. And watch how you answered. The silence this time was different. Dumbledore set his laced fingers down on the desk. He looked at Harry with the full weight of something he'd been carrying for 11 years, and Harry sat opposite him and did not look away. Your mother, Dumbledore said, was one of the finest witches I have ever known. Not because of her power, though that was considerable. Because of her precision. The care with which she thought about everything. He paused. You have her eyes. I know, Harry said. Your father was, Dumbledore stopped. Chose. Brilliant and careless and loyal beyond reason. He would have been proud of you. Would he have understood me? The question came out slightly different than Harry had intended it, more honest, less strategic, and he registered that and didn't take it back. Dumbledore's expression did something very quiet and real. I think, he said carefully, that he would have needed time to learn how. Harry nodded. He stood up. The third floor, he said. Tell me when it becomes relevant for me to know. I will tell you, Dumbledore said, rather earlier than I would tell most. That's all I'm asking, Harry said. He was at the door when Dumbledore spoke again. Harry. Using his first name for the first time. Harry stopped, didn't turn around. I owe you an explanation. About the department. About the choices I made. I have no illusions that Croaker has kept it from you. Harry's hand was on the door. No, he said. He hasn't. Then you know that you did what you thought was necessary, Harry said. Everyone does. He opened the door. I'm not interested in whether it was wrong. I'm interested in whether you learned from it. He left Dumbledore's office and walked back through the castle, and the staircases didn't move at all. By the end of September he had a functional map of the social and magical landscape of Hogwarts, an ongoing hypothesis about Quirrell that was hardening from suspicion toward certainty, 3 people he might tentatively describe as important to him, and 2 specific problems he had not yet solved. The first was the 3rd floor. The second was himself. He sat by the window in the dormitory one night after the others were asleep and looked at the grounds, silver in moonlight, the forest at the edge dark and occupied, the lake black and still. He had his compass out, Blythe's compass, and the needle was going wild, as it always did inside the castle, too much ambient magic to calibrate. He held it until the metal was warm from his hand. He had grown up in the Department of Mysteries and learned everything there was to know about death and time and love as theoretical forces, as subjects of study, as shapes in the dark. He was 11 years old and sitting in a dormitory with 4 sleeping boys, and he could feel, in the way you feel something without being able to name it yet, that being here, being around people, consistently, in the ordinary texture of ordinary days, was doing something to him that the department never had. He wasn't sure yet if it was opening something or breaking something. He watched the grounds and held the compass and let himself not know for a while. That was a thing the department had taught him, that not knowing was only dangerous if you pretended you knew. If you sat honestly in the not knowing, sometimes it told you things. He sat there until the clouds came across the moon, and then he lay down, and slept. Chapter 3, Things That Should Not Be Known. October arrived like a closed fist. The castle turned cold between one week and the next, not gradually, not with the polite transition of early autumn, but with the particular decisiveness of a very old place that had its own opinions about seasons. The torches burned higher and the portraits became more talkative, and something in the walls shifted its register, that deep bass magical hum dropping half a note into something that felt, if you were the kind of person who tracked these things, distinctly like alertness. Harry noticed on the 3rd of October, walking the 5th floor corridor at 6 in the morning. He stopped mid-stride, put his hand against the stone, and felt the castle's changed frequency like a pulse under his fingers. Something had changed. Or something was coming. He filed it and went to breakfast. The common room had its own October shift, which was less mystical and more hormonal, the first wave of exam anxiety hitting the upper years like a weather system, stress fracturing along the fault lines of existing friendships, people who'd been fine in September suddenly sharp at the edges. Harry observed this with detached interest. First years were insulated from it mostly, not yet knowing enough to be frightened by assessments, which was either innocence or ignorance depending on how you looked at it. He was sitting by the fire with his astronomy homework, not because he found it difficult but because mapping stellar positions required a particular meditative attention that he'd learned to use as thinking cover, his hands moving on the chart while his mind worked something else, when Hermione dropped into the chair opposite him with the force of someone who had been walking briskly and decided to stop. "Quirrell's hands," she said. Harry kept mapping. "What about them?" "They're getting worse. The shaking pattern. It was every 40 minutes or so in the first week, now it's closer to every 15. She pulled out her notebook. She had 3, each a different color, which Harry had worked out was a categorization system, and opened the red one. "I've been timing it. And there's a secondary indicator." His voice changes registered just before. "Like something is pressing through." "Something is pressing through," Harry said. She looked at him. This was the moment, he knew. He'd been accumulating evidence for a month and his hypothesis had graduated from suspicion to near certainty, and the only remaining question was what he did with that certainty and who he gave it to. He put his quill down. "What do you know about Voldemort?" he asked. Hermione didn't flinch at the name. He'd noticed before that she didn't. She'd been raised by Muggles, had come to the magical world through books rather than through a community that had spent a decade flinching from a name, and she'd picked up the name the same way she'd picked up everything else, as a word that meant a specific thing and ought to be said precisely. He respected that. "Enough," she said. "The basics. The history. His body was destroyed the night my parents died," Harry said. "That's the canonical version. Body destroyed, power spent, gone." He looked at the fire. "But gone is a word people use when they mean, I don't want to investigate further. Croker, the man who raised me, Croker used to say that the universe was extremely reluctant to destroy anything completely. Matter, energy, consciousness. Things don't vanish. They transform." Hermione was very still. "You think he's not gone?" "I think his body is gone," Harry said. "I think his consciousness survived. And I think," he looked at her, "that something is living in Quirrell's turban." The fire crackled. Somewhere above them a portrait shifted on its hook. Hermione sat with her notebook open in her lap and worked through it, and he could see her doing it, not reacting, not catastrophizing, just following the logic with the linear efficiency of her mind. "That's why the turban is a containment charm," she said. "It's not containing Quirrell's secret," Harry said. "It's Quirrell containing him. Barely. So Quirrell came back from wherever he went over summer, Albania, the file says, and he came back different. He came back occupied." She absorbed this. "Does Dumbledore know?" "Dumbledore knows a great deal," Harry said carefully. "Whether he knows this specifically, I don't yet know. Should we tell him?" Harry picked up his quill and went back to the star chart. "I'm deciding." Hermione looked at him. "Deciding what, exactly?" "Whether Dumbledore knowing changes the outcome, or whether it just changes who's making the decisions." He drew a careful line between 2 stellar positions. "I don't think we're in danger yet. Whatever Voldemort's here for, it isn't us. It's something in the school that he needs and doesn't have yet." "The 3rd floor," Hermione said immediately. "Yes." She sat back in her chair. She had the expression she sometimes got when a problem had revealed its true shape and was more interesting and more dangerous than she'd initially assessed. "Right," she said quietly. "Okay." A pause. "I need to think about this." "So do I," Harry said. "That's what the star chart is for." She looked at the star chart. You're thinking by doing repetitive work. Yes. I bake, she said, incongruously. Harry blinked. What? When I need to think properly. Bake. Repetitive, tactile, precise. She made a small gesture at the Hogwarts context. I've been using organizing my notes instead. It's not the same. Harry looked at this information and found he didn't know what to do with it, which was unusual for him, and which he registered as interesting. He stopped. Start it again. I'll let you know when I have more. I'll do the same, she said, and opened her blue notebook. The first Quidditch practice was a thing that happened to Harry rather than a thing he'd planned, which was itself unusual. Oliver Wood found him, literally found him, tracked him down with the focused energy of a person on a mission, which was apparently Oliver Wood's factory setting, in the library on a Thursday evening and stood across the table from him and said, simply, "You're a seeker." Harry looked up. "I haven't tried." "McGonagall says you have," her words, preternatural spatial processing and threat response coordination. Wood said this with the reverence of someone quoting scripture. Which is seeker attributes, basically. So. Try out. I've never been on a broom in competitive context. I know. But you've flown before. Harry had, in fact. The department had no grounds for it, but Croker had taken him to a ministry facility twice a year from age 7, on the grounds that it was an important wizarding skill and that there was no acceptable reason for an unspeakable sword to be unable to fly. Harry had approached broomwork the way he approached most physical skills, as a system to understand rather than an instinct to develop, and had arrived at competence through analysis before finally, at 9, the analysis had integrated into his body and he'd stopped thinking about it and just flown, which was when it had become something different. Something he'd never quite found a word for. Yes, Harry said. I've flown. Great. Wood slapped both hands on the table with the satisfaction of a problem solved. Saturday. Dawn. The pitch. Saturday at dawn the pitch was empty and cold and the dew was still on the grass and the air had that sharp particular quality of early October mornings that Harry associated, now, with the castle's changed frequency. Wood was already there with a broomstick, a Nimbus 2000, the current standard, and he handed it over with the solemnity of someone performing a formal handover. Harry mounted, kicked off, and the ground dropped away. He went straight up, not gradually, not with the cautious ascent of someone testing the equipment, straight up, fast, the air turning colder and cleaner with altitude, the castle below him suddenly small and perfect in the early light, its towers catching the first real sun of the morning. He leveled off 300 feet up and held position, weight balanced, and looked at the grounds. He could see everything from here. The lake. The forest edge. The Quidditch pitch laid out below him like a diagram of itself. And beyond all of it, the hills in the distance, and past them, theoretically, London. He stayed up there for a while. Just that. Wood was shouting something from below that Harry eventually deduced was appreciative rather than alarmed. He came down, and Wood released the snitch, and what happened next took approximately 4 minutes and involved Harry making 3 directional changes that Wood later described as mechanically impossible and one near vertical dive that ended with the snitch caught between 2 fingers 6 inches from the ground. Wood looked at him. Harry looked at the snitch. It was struggling between his fingers, wings beating, and he opened his hand and let it go. "Why did you?" Wood started. "I wanted to catch it," Harry said. "I didn't want to keep it." He watched it disappear into the early morning air. "I'll play, if you want." Wood made a sound that may have been a small prayer of thanks. He told no one about the other thing he'd found. In the evenings, sometimes, when the dormitory was occupied and the common room was noisy and Harry needed the kind of quiet that wasn't just silence but space, he walked. The castle had a way of opening if you paid it the right kind of attention, not looking for specific rooms, not following maps, but following the quality of the air and the way the torchlight behaved and the subtle variations in the magical hum. 3 times now it had led him to corridors he hadn't found in the records, to rooms that weren't on any map he'd been able to access. The room he found on the 14th of October was on the 7th floor, in a stretch of corridor opposite a tapestry of a man being chased by trolls, and it didn't exist until he was walking past it with sufficient aimlessness of intent, at which point a door appeared in the wall with the quiet decisiveness of something that had been waiting for the right person. He stopped and looked at it. Then he opened it and went inside. The room was large and lined with objects of every description, piled and stacked and hovering, layers and layers of things, the detritus of centuries of people hiding what they couldn't throw away. But that wasn't what caught his attention. What caught his attention was the mirror. It stood at the back of the room on its own, as if it had claimed a space by virtue of gravity or reputation, and it was tall, taller than him by twice, with an inscription along the top that Harry recognized as an anagram before he'd consciously decoded it. Erist stra eru oit ube kafru oit unwosi. He worked it backwards while he was still walking toward it and stopped 3 feet away when he had it. I show not your face but your heart's desire. He stood in front of it and looked at what it showed him. He had prepared himself, intellectually, for something along the lines of what the historical records said the mirror showed, the deepest and most desperate desires of the viewer's heart, usually the obvious things, family, success, love, power, depending on the viewer. He had considered, before entering the room, that he might see Croaker, or Okonkwo and Blythe, or some abstraction of professional achievement. He had considered that he might see himself in various contexts that would tell him something interesting about his own desires. He had not prepared himself for what was actually there. In the mirror, Harry stood in a room that was flooded with warm light, afternoon light, the kind that came through west-facing windows at 5 o'clock when the day was winding down. He, Mirror Harry, was sitting at a table. Sitting across from him, animatedly talking, gesturing, was a woman with red hair and green eyes. At the counter behind them, making tea with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had made tea in this kitchen 10,000 times, was a man with dark untidy hair that stood up at the back exactly like Harry's did. Mirror Harry was laughing at something his mother had said. His father turned from the counter and rolled his eyes at whatever it was in the way of someone who had heard the joke before and liked it anyway. The mirror showed him a Tuesday afternoon. It showed him an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in an ordinary kitchen with his parents alive and the light coming through the window and someone making tea. Harry stood in front of it and did not move for a long time. He was not, he would have said, a person who performed grief. He'd grown up with the fact of his parents' deaths as a background truth, not absent, not unfelt, but located in a part of himself that he'd learned to manage the way you manage the other contained things, with attention and distance and the understanding that emotion was real data but not always actionable data. He thought of the photograph in his trunk, the woman laughing, the man with the hair. He thought of what Neville had said, sometimes I just want my mom. He stood in front of the mirror for a long time, and the light in it didn't change, afternoon holding itself still, and his parents moved in the easy natural way of people who didn't know they were being watched. Then he took a breath, turned around, and walked out of the room. He didn't go back the next evening. He thought about it with an honesty that surprised him, because the wanting to go back was stronger than he'd expected, and stronger wants required more careful handling. He went to the library instead. He sat with his books and his star chart and he let himself know that the mirror was there, that it had shown him something real, and that going back would not make the thing it showed him more real. It would make the gap between the mirror and the world wider. Croaker had taught him that. Not directly, Croaker had never anticipated needing to teach him about magical mirrors, but in the broader principle, the thing that shows you what you want and doesn't give it to you is not comfort. It is a very efficient tool for producing incapacity. He filed the mirror. He kept not going back. He did not entirely stop thinking about it, which was different. The troll happened on Halloween. It was not, in Harry's assessment, the most sophisticated security incident the castle had encountered, but it was effective in the way blunt instruments were effective, through sheer overwhelming physicality and the advantage of surprise. Mountain trolls were not intelligent in the conventional sense, but they were 12 feet tall and had a genetic tendency toward destruction that made intention somewhat beside the point. The feast had been interrupted by Quirrell, which Harry noted as an escalation, because Quirrell had been managing his concealment carefully for weeks, and breaking cover in front of the entire school was either desperation or a deliberate action, stumbling into the hall in a performance of terror that was approximately 60% genuine and 40% theatrical overstatement, announcing that there was a troll in the dungeons, and then fainting. The fainting was theatrical, Harry thought. Voldemort wouldn't have let Quirrell faint genuinely. Dumbledore directed the school to return to dormitories with the calm of someone who had contingency plans for contingencies. Prefects swept up students like tidewaters. Harry went with the flow for 15 seconds, thought about the fact that Hermione had not been at the feast because she'd been in the library when he'd last seen her and had still been there when the feast started, and veered out of the stream and down toward the girls' bathrooms on the second floor. He arrived at approximately the same time as Ron Weasley, which was unexpected, and Ron looked at him with the expression of someone who'd had the same thought and made the same choice. "She wasn't at the feast," Ron said, slightly breathless. "No," Harry said. "So I thought, same." They looked at each other. It was, Harry would later think, the exact moment when Ron Weasley went from person sharing a dormitory to something with a different word, because people who ran toward the same trouble for the same reason without stopping to negotiate at first, that was a specific kind of person. The troll was in the bathroom. They established this quickly from the smell alone. Mountain trolls had a specific olfactory signature that was roughly equivalent to something large having died in something wet, and Harry shoved the door open with his shoulder and assessed the situation in approximately 1 second. Troll, 12 feet, wooden club. Hermione backed into the corner between two sinks with her arms up and her eyes wide, the troll winding up. Harry flicked his wand. The club came out of the troll's hand so fast it left a vacuum. He'd hit it with a summoning charm of significantly more force than the first-year curriculum covered, and the club shot across the bathroom and embedded itself in the wall tiles 6 inches deep. The troll turned, confused, registering that something had changed. Harry hit it with a knockback jinx in the left knee, not the standard force, significantly enhanced, and then a sticking charm on its feet while it was still off balance from the knee impact, and the troll went down like a building coming apart, which was an impressive amount of impact sound and debris. It was conscious. Confused. Stuck. Harry stood and looked at it while it tried to make sense of what had happened to it, and the troll did not make sense of it because mountain trolls were not built for that quality of reflection. Ron was staring. Hermione was staring. "Are you hurt?" Harry asked her. She opened and closed her mouth. Then, with what he was coming to recognize as characteristic Hermione Granger composure recovery speed, "No. I'm fine." She looked at the troll. You didn't knock it out." "I don't need to knock out everything I stop," Harry said. "It's stuck." "That's sufficient." He looked at the troll, which was making low bewildered sounds. It was probably let in on purpose. Someone opened a pathway. "Someone," Ron said carefully. "Someone," Harry confirmed. The professors arrived seconds later, McGonagall, Snape, Quirrell, the latter looking appropriately shaken in a way that was genuine this time because Harry suspected walking around hosting Voldemort and then having someone else stop the troll he'd presumably arranged required genuine recalibration. McGonagall looked at the troll embedded in the tile floor and the 3 first years and did a full structural survey of her own expression before settling on controlled disapproval. "Can you explain this?" she asked. "Troll," Harry said. "We stopped it." "With what, precisely?" Snape said, looking at the troll with the expression of a man examining evidence at a scene. "Basic knockback jinx on the knee joint," Harry said. "Force-enhanced summoning on the weapon. Sticking charm on the feet." He paused. The summoning was probably slightly beyond curriculum. Snape's eye twitched. "Just slightly." "Slightly," he repeated. "I can demonstrate the exact force calculation if you'd like to file an incident report." The silence that followed this had several layers. McGonagall looked at Harry with an expression he was becoming familiar with, the expression of someone who had revised their expectations upward several times and kept finding the revisions insufficient. 10 points to Gryffindor, she said finally. Each. For sheer presence of mind. She looked at the troll. And 5 points from each of you for the catastrophic rule-breaking of not going to your dormitory. Net positive, Ron said, and then looked like he wished he hadn't. McGonagall was not entirely successful at suppressing her expression. Quirrell had been quiet through all of this. Harry looked at him now, directly, not legilimency, nothing that obvious, just the particular quality of attention that amounted to the same thing if you were sufficiently practiced. Quirrell met his eyes and looked away quickly. Voldemort, behind the turban, did not look away. Harry could feel it, the pressure of a gaze that was not Quirrell's, a quality of assessment that had an entirely different character, colder and more specific. It lasted 3 seconds. Then Quirrell coughed and turned to examine the troll. Harry turned away and looked at nothing in particular and thought, so now he knows I'm here. November began with the Quidditch match. Harry had not spent much time thinking about Quidditch as a significant event. He'd agreed to play because Wood's enthusiasm was genuinely compelling and because the flying itself was worth having, not because he particularly cared about the outcome of interhouse competitions. But the match against Slytherin had a quality of collective investment that he found he couldn't be entirely unmoved by, which was interesting and worth noting. He played the way he did most things, paying total attention, with the complete quieting of everything non-essential that the department had trained into him over years. The crowd disappeared, not unimportant, but unrelated. Malfoy's taunting during practice the week before disappeared. The score, somewhere below him, disappeared. There was the pitch, the sky, the snitch when it was there to be found, and between the start and the moment he saw it, 15 minutes in, a flash of gold near the Slytherin goalposts, nothing had real priority except position and angle and wind. He went for it. His broom bucked violently a minute later, not weather, not mechanics, a magical interference with a specific quality he recognized as intentional because accidental broom malfunctions didn't have that precision. He held on through muscle memory while his mind went very quickly through the source location question, tracking the angle of the interference, the feel of it. Someone in the stands was jinxing his broom. He identified the direction. Hermione was in the stands. He couldn't see her clearly, but he knew from the magical signature a minute later that someone had set fire to something in approximately the right location, because the jinx stopped immediately. He regained control, located the snitch again, and caught it in just under 2 minutes. In the aftermath, on the ground, with Wood making noise and the team surrounding him, Hermione found him with a small scorch mark on her robe sleeve and an expression that was simultaneously satisfied and annoyed. It was Snape, she said quietly. He was muttering, the jinx counter-signature was consistent with his wand work in class. Harry looked at his broom. He thought about Snape's expression in potions on the first day, the complex thing that happened behind his professionalism. Yes, he said. He was trying to knock you off your broom. Or he was trying to test something, Harry said. There's a difference. Hermione stared at him. He was interfering with your broomstick during a competitive match. And you set him on fire. Not on fire, she said, slightly defensive. Just, a contained flame. On his robes. Well, Harry said. Fair enough. She looked at him. You're not going to do anything about it. Not yet, Harry said. I want to understand why first. He looked toward where Snape stood at the edge of the pitch, talking to McGonagall with the expression of someone who had been recently and justifiably set on fire and was too professional to mention it. There are things about Snape's relationship to my father that I haven't fully mapped yet. And things about his relationship to Dumbledore. And things about what side he's actually on. Hermione was quiet for a moment. You don't know if he's the threat or if he's watching the threat. No, Harry said. But the fact that I can't tell is itself interesting. She absorbed this. Then, you should have told me about the broom interference earlier. I was busy catching the snitch. Harry. I'm telling you now. She made a sound of frustrated exasperation that he was coming to understand as affectionate. Right, she said. Fine. What do you need me to do? Keep watching Snape, he said. Same way you've been watching Quirrell. Watch what changes. She pulled out the red notebook. You know this is a lot for 2 people. 3, Harry said. Ron's better at reading people than he thinks he is. Hermione looked toward where Ron was attempting to get a 3rd helping of the celebratory food that someone had produced. He is, isn't he, she said, almost to herself. Yes, Harry said. His emotional read is instinctive rather than analytical. That's a different tool. Useful. Hermione nodded, with the expression of someone adding a data point to a model. I'll talk to him. He went back to the mirror exactly once more. December. The castle emptied for Christmas with an enthusiasm that Harry found surprising in its scale, the absolute evacuation of a building, most of it choosing warmth and family over staying, and Harry stayed because the department was not home in the same way it had been before Hogwarts, and Hogwarts was not yet home in the way the department had been, and he was navigating the geography of that displacement without a map. Ron stayed, which Harry hadn't expected and was glad of in a way he filed without examining too closely. Neville went home to his gran. Hermione went home to her parents. She had, the morning she left, pressed a book into his hands without ceremony, a Muggle novel, which he hadn't expected, something from the 20th century about a girl solving crimes through the application of relentless logic and absolute refusal to accept conventional limitations. He'd looked at it. What's this? I thought you might like it, she said, in a voice that was almost casual and wasn't quite. She's a bit like you. Minus the magic. Plus more willingness to admit when she's worried. She picked up her bag and went to catch the carriages. Harry stood with the book in his hands and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that wouldn't have been inadequate. He read it on Christmas Eve, cover to cover, in front of the fire in an almost empty common room. He found she was right about the protagonist, which was unsurprising. The second time he went to the mirror, it was Christmas night, and the castle was deep in its particular winter quiet. He went back not because he'd decided to but because his feet took him there while he was thinking about other things, which was itself information about what he was doing when he wasn't paying attention to himself. The room was exactly as he'd left it. The mirror was exactly as it had been. He stood in front of it. His parents in the afternoon kitchen. His mother laughing. His father at the counter with the tea. He watched it for longer this time. He let himself, without the usual management, just feel what it was like to be standing there. It moved through him like something physical, not grief, not exactly, something that didn't have a name because he'd never had cause to name it before. A want so specific and so irresolvable that it had a texture to it, a weight. He stood there until Dumbledore spoke from behind him. I thought I might find you here. Harry didn't startle. He had felt the approach, the weight of that presence, and had allowed himself to keep looking at the mirror anyway, which was itself a kind of choice. Second time, Harry said. That's enough. Is it? I know what it shows me. Knowing it twice doesn't change the information. He turned around. Dumbledore was standing near the door in his dressing gown, and he looked older, somehow, in the firelight without the setting of the headmaster's office around him. Just a very old man standing in a room full of abandoned things. What does it show you? Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Socks, he said. Harry looked at him. I am lying, Dumbledore said quietly. It shows me my family. Whole, as they have not been in a very long time. He looked at the mirror over Harry's shoulder. It shows me things that are gone. Then we both know the same thing, Harry said. That what's gone is gone, and looking at it doesn't help. And yet you came back. Once, Harry said. People are allowed once. He moved toward the door. Are you going to tell me not to come back again? I don't think I need to, Dumbledore said. You've already decided. Yes. Harry paused at the door. He looked at Dumbledore. Something he'd been carrying all term moved in him, the conversation from October, the incomplete things, the weight of what the old man owed him and hadn't given yet. You said you'd tell me what was under the third floor when it became relevant. I did. It's becoming relevant. Dumbledore studied him. You feel it too, then? The castle's frequency has been off since October, Harry said. Something is being pressured. Whatever's down there is being looked for. He paused. Quirrell has been spending evenings in the third-floor corridor since the end of November. I've tracked the pattern. The silence that settled over Dumbledore's face was not surprise. It was the specific quality of silence that belonged to a man having his expectations confirmed ahead of schedule. What I am about to tell you, Dumbledore said carefully, is between us. And Hermione Granger and Ron Weasley, Harry said. Dumbledore blinked. They're already involved, Harry said. They have been since October. Hermione is the one who identified the containment charm on the turban. Weasley tracked Quirrell's patrol route from the Gryffindor Tower windows because his dormitory has the right angle. He paused. They're careful and they're capable. Excluding them is not protection, it's inefficiency. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. Then he sat down on a nearby crate, slightly undignified, and seemingly unbothered by this, and folded his hands. The Philosopher's Stone, he said, belongs to Nicholas Flamel. Harry had known the name. He'd known it was likely a stone from the layered magical signature. He filed this as confirmation and listened. Dumbledore explained Flamel, the elixir, Gringotts, the decision to bring the stone to Hogwarts for protection. Harry listened with the focused silence he brought to important information, not interrupting, not reacting, just absorbing. When Dumbledore finished, Harry stood in the doorway of the room of hidden things and looked at the old man on his crate. You brought it here to draw him out, Harry said. Dumbledore didn't answer immediately. The protections you put in place, Harry said. They're not impenetrable. You know that. You made them navigable, challenging enough to filter out casual attempts, designed enough that someone with specific knowledge could work through them. You made a path. He paused. You want Voldemort to try for it. I want to understand what he is now, Dumbledore said quietly. What he has become. Whether he can be defeated in this form or whether he requires a different resolution. You're using the stone as diagnostic equipment. I am trying to understand the problem before the problem becomes unsurvivable, Dumbledore said, and for the first time Harry heard, under the careful measured speech, something that was tired and afraid and had been both for a very long time. Harry considered this. Considered Dumbledore. Considered the tired thing under the performance of controlled wisdom. He's a Horcrux, Harry said. Dumbledore went very still. Not the stone. Voldemort. What survived? What's in Quirrell? Harry kept his voice level. I found the consciousness anchor theory in the restricted section in September. I've been working through it since October. The magical signature on whatever is in that turban has the specific quality of divided intentionality, something that is and is not one thing simultaneously. That's not a possessing spirit. That's a fragment of a soul that was deliberately separated from its host. Dumbledore was looking at him with an expression that Harry could not decode, which was unusual, and he took a moment to try. It was not surprise, or not entirely. It was something closer to the expression he'd imagined on Croaker's face, if he'd ever managed to outthink Croaker, which he hadn't yet, the expression of a mentor recognizing the moment when what they've made has exceeded what they made it from. How many? Harry asked. I don't know yet, Dumbledore said, very quietly. But more than one. Yes. And the stone would extend his life in this form long enough to build a body, Harry said. Which is why he can't have it. Not because it would resurrect him, he already exists, sort of, but because it would give him time. He looked at the mirror, then away. He needs a body to make more. Or to use the ones that already exist. Dumbledore looked at him for a long time. Harry, he said. How old are you? 11, Harry said. Why? I am checking, Dumbledore said, whether it is possible that I am having this conversation with an 11-year-old. It is possible, Harry said. And you are. He looked at the door. I'm going to bed. Croaker will want a full brief on this when term starts. He paused. He already suspects most of it, I think. He would have thought through the survival question years ago. He and I agreed, Dumbledore said, not to discuss Voldemort's survival openly until there was evidence sufficient to act on. There's now evidence sufficient to act on, Harry said. Yes, Dumbledore said. I rather think there is. Harry left him in the room of hidden things, sitting on a crate in his dressing gown, the mirror showing him something gone, and walked back through the castle to the Gryffindor Tower. He passed the portrait of the fat lady, who had fallen asleep at her post, and didn't wake her. He found the microseam in the warding and bypassed it, slipped inside, closed it behind him. Ron was awake, unexpectedly, sitting by the fire with a chess piece in his hand that he was turning over and over. Couldn't sleep, Ron said, not looking up. No, Harry agreed. Ron looked at him. He had the expression he sometimes had, the one that looked uncomplicated on the surface and wasn't, not entirely. You're doing that thing where you found something out and you're deciding how much to say. Harry sat down in the other chair. Yes. Is it bad? Harry thought about the mirror. The afternoon kitchen. The tea. Then he thought about Voldemort in Quirrell's turban and the Philosopher's Stone in the floor and the chain of Horcruxes he didn't know the shape of yet. It's complicated, he said. Ron was quiet for a moment. Can I help? Harry looked at him. He thought about what he'd said to Hermione, that Ron's emotional read was instinctive rather than analytical. He thought about the fact that Ron had run toward a girl's bathroom containing a mountain troll without stopping to assess the risk, because Hermione had been inside it. Yes, Harry said. You can help. Ron put the chess piece down. Right. Tell me. Harry told him. Not everything, not the mirror, not the particular private weight of standing in front of it, that wasn't relevant and wasn't Ron's, but Quirrell and Voldemort and the stone and the Horcrux theory and the conversation with Dumbledore. Ron listened with total attention, which Harry had noticed before was one of Ron's underrated qualities, the full-body quality of his listening, the complete absence of performing comprehension while you were still talking. When Harry finished, Ron sat quietly for a moment. Right, he said. So Voldemort's in the school and he's after the stone and he might have made bits of himself and hidden them. That's the summary, yes. And you've known since October. Working theory since October. Confirmed tonight. Ron looked at him. And you didn't tell me before because, I wasn't sure how much you wanted to know, Harry said honestly. Ron considered this. Then, I want to know. All of it. His jaw had that quality it sometimes had, the stubborn set of someone who decided something. Whatever you're doing about it. I'm in. Harry looked at him for a moment. Okay, he said. It was the simplest sentence and the largest. They sat by the fire a while longer, not talking, mostly, just both being awake in the same room with the same knowledge, and eventually the fire burned down and they went to bed, and outside the castle the snow was coming in off the hills, and somewhere below them the stone sat in its protections waiting for a crisis that was now very much scheduled to arrive. Harry lay in the dark with his eyes open and thought about what he knew and what he didn't and what it was going to take when the time came. He was not afraid. He thought about the mirror. His mother's laugh. The ordinary afternoon. He let himself have that, just for a moment, before he put it away. Then he closed his eyes and went over everything he knew about Horcruxes, from the beginning. Chapter 4, The Language of Violence. January came back cold and with purpose. The castle's frequency had stabilized over Christmas. Whatever pressure Harry had felt building through November and December seemed to have eased slightly, the way a storm eased between its first warning and its arrival. He didn't trust the easing. Storms didn't go away because they went quiet. They went quiet because they were organizing. He came back to Hogwarts on the 1st of January, a day before most students, because the department's owl had found him at Ron's house, where he'd spent 3 days after Christmas, an experience so comprehensively unlike anything in his previous life that he was still processing it, and Croaker's message had said simply, "Call when you're back. We need to talk." He found an empty classroom on the 2nd floor, cast the privacy wards he'd learned at 8 years old, and activated the enchanted coin Croaker had given him before September. Not a two-way mirror, too obvious, too easy to intercept, but a resonance device that used a specific frequency of ambient magic to establish communication, the same underlying principle as the fleu but private in a way the fleu fundamentally wasn't. Croaker's voice came through without preamble. "Tell me about Quirrell." So Harry told him. Everything, the turban, the signature, the consciousness anchor theory, Dumbledore's confirmation of the stone, the Horcrux hypothesis. He spoke for 11 minutes. When he finished, the silence on the other end had the particular quality of Croaker absorbing and arranging information, which Harry had grown up reading the way other people read facial expressions. "The Horcrux theory," Croaker said finally. "You came to that independently." "The restricted section has Herpo's original texts," Harry said. "Incomplete, but enough. The Soul Division signature is consistent with what you'd expect from a Horcrux host, yes." A pause. "How certain are you about the number?" "Not certain." "Multiple." "Dumbledore suspects more than one." "Dumbledore has suspected for years," Croaker said. "He's been building a case. The fact that he's told you means he's changed his approach." Another pause. "Or you changed it for him." "Both, probably." "Harry." Croaker's voice settled into the register he used when he was being precise. "This is now a department matter, not a school matter. I want you to understand what I mean by that. What you're describing, a fragmented consciousness surviving bodily death through deliberate soul division, operating parasitically through a host, that's beyond the scope of any Auror protocol. It's metaphysical threat classification. I know. You are 11 years old and living in a school. I'm aware of my age and location. Don't be clever. I'm telling you that you are not alone in this. The department is aware. We are building a framework. And you," a pause that had weight to it, "you are not the solution to this problem on your own, regardless of your training." Harry was quiet for a moment. Outside the classroom, distantly, a staircase moved. "Croaker," he said. "Yes." "What did you know?" "Before I went to Hogwarts." "About Voldemort's survival." The pause this time was longer. "We had a working theory," Croaker said. "Not confirmed. Not confirmed enough to act on. But you sent me to Hogwarts anyway." "I sent you to Hogwarts because it was time and because you needed," Croaker stopped. Started again. "Because the department is not a school and I am not your father and there were things you needed that I couldn't give you there." His voice was flat and careful and honest. "The theory about Voldemort's survival was a factor I weighed. You sent me to the place where you thought Voldemort was going to appear. I sent you to the place where you would be safest if he did," Croaker said. "And where you would be positioned to contribute if it became necessary." Harry looked at the wall of the empty classroom. He thought about this, not with anger, exactly, but with the specific precision of someone examining a decision for its actual structure rather than its stated logic. Croaker had always been honest with him. Croaker had also always been, first and foremost, the head of the Department of Mysteries, which meant that honesty and strategy occupied the same sentence without contradiction. "All right," Harry said. "You're not angry." "I don't think you were wrong," Harry said. "I think you were incomplete." He picked up the resonance device. "I'll keep you updated." Harry. Croaker's voice, just slightly, changed register. "Be careful." "I'm always careful." "You're always precise," Croaker said. "That's different. Careful includes accounting for variables you haven't identified yet." Harry thought about that. "Fair," he said. He closed the connection. He sat in the empty classroom for a while, in the privacy of his own wards, and let himself think about the variables he hadn't identified yet. He came up with 6. He filed them and went to breakfast. The term had a different quality to it. Something had shifted in the architecture of his days, not the routine, which was the same: classes, meals, the castle at night, the ongoing project of understanding Hogwarts as an ecosystem, but the texture inside the routine. He noticed it first in small ways. Ron saving him a seat at breakfast without being asked. Hermione leaving books she'd finished on his bed with margin notes in a different color ink, a color she used only for him. Neville stopping him in corridors to ask questions that weren't really questions but were more like checking in the specific way Neville checked in, through the side door of a real inquiry. He had, at some point he couldn't precisely identify, stopped being alone in the way he'd always been alone. It was, he decided, neither comfortable nor uncomfortable. It was simply different. New data. He thought about at least in charms, which had accelerated since the first weeks in a way that pleased Flitwick visibly, and most in history of magic, which remained sufficiently understimulating to leave his mind free to wander. During one particularly comprehensive drone about the 1752 troll exemptions, Harry found himself thinking about the photograph in his trunk, which he'd moved, recently, from between 2 books to the actual surface of his bedside table, a decision he'd made without making it and had noticed afterward with the dispassion of someone noting a behavioral change. He'd been making quite a few decisions without making them, lately. Defense against the dark arts continued to be an exercise in managed performance on Quirrell's part, and on Harry's part an exercise in watching managed performance and tracking its degradation. By mid-January the intervals between Voldemort's pressure events had shortened to approximately every 8 minutes. Harry could track them by the fractional changes in Quirrell's magical signature, barely perceptible, but consistent, and the quality of the teaching was declining with them, because it was increasingly difficult to maintain a coherent lecture when something was actively pushing against the inside of your skull. What Quirrell taught was fine, technically correct, appropriately paced for the curriculum, and almost entirely useless to Harry, who had been executing nonverbal shield variants since he was 9. He used the class time for observation, which felt like the appropriate use given the circumstances. Voldemort, in the turban, was watching him back. Not constantly. Not obviously. But there was a quality to certain moments in the class, when Harry spoke, or demonstrated a spell, or asked a question that cut to the theoretical foundations of what they were doing, where the consciousness behind Quirrell's eyes clarified, sharpened, with the focused interest of something that was paying very specific attention. Harry didn't break eye contact during those moments. He held it, evenly, and let whatever Voldemort was reading from him be read. He had very few secrets, when it came down to it. His strengths were not things he tried to conceal. It seemed more useful to be accurately understood than to perform limitations he didn't have. Malfoy caught him in the corridor between defense and transfiguration on a Wednesday, which Harry had not specifically anticipated but had considered as a probability given Malfoy's pattern. He tended to make his moves in transitional spaces, between classes, when the social witnesses were diffuse and plausible deniability was built into the geography. He had Crabbe and Goyle flanking him. They were large and slow in the way of things that were large and slow, and they served a function in Malfoy's architecture that was more aesthetic than practical, physical emphasis for conversations that Malfoy wanted to land as more significant than they were. Potter. Malfoy stopped in front of him. He had the particular posture of someone who'd practiced this, shoulders back, chin at the angle that was meant to communicate authority rather than aggression. Harry had met 3 junior unspeakables with the same posture. It meant someone's family had taught them to enter rooms like they owned them, which was useful in some contexts and deeply insufficient in others. "I've been meaning to talk to you." "Go ahead," Harry said. He didn't stop walking. Malfoy had to turn and fall into step beside him or look like he was being dismissed, and his choosing to keep pace told Harry that the conversation mattered to him. "You're wasted in Gryffindor," Malfoy said. "My father knows people in the ministry. People who know about your background. Where you grew up." He paused for effect. The Department of Mysteries doesn't sort its people into houses. They sort them by usefulness. That's accurate, Harry said. Malfoy looked slightly thrown by the agreement. So you understand that affiliation is a political tool. Gryffindor is, it's sentimental. It's the house of people who mistake bravery for strategy. He glanced sideways at Harry. Slytherin is where people who actually understand power end up. Slytherin, Harry said thoughtfully, is where people who understand a particular kind of power end up. Institutional power. Inherited power. Power that depends on other people's recognition for its function. He turned a corner. Malfoy turned with him. That's a real kind of power. I don't have it and I don't especially want it. You have influence, I have something more irritating than influence, Harry said. I have competence. Competence doesn't need a house to function. Malfoy's jaw tightened. My father has not met me, Harry said. And won't, particularly, change what I can and can't do. He stopped walking and turned to look at Malfoy properly. Not unkindly, this was important, the distinction between dismissal and clarity, and Malfoy was being offered clarity because it seemed more respectful. I don't have anything against you, Malfoy. You're not wrong that the house system is a political mechanism. You're wrong that it's the only one worth understanding. I'd suggest studying the department's organizational model if you want to know how power actually structures itself. He paused. The door to transfiguration is that one. He went through it, leaving Malfoy in the corridor with Crabbe and Goyle and the specific expression of someone who has been declined so cleanly they can't quite name what happened. McGonagall was at her desk. She had heard, Harry suspected from the quality of her not looking up, at least the last 30 seconds of the conversation through the door, which was fine. He sat down. Neville leaned over from the adjacent seat. What was that about? Malfoy invited me to be a Slytherin. Neville thought about this. Are you? No. Neville nodded, satisfied, and opened his textbook. The real shift happened on a Tuesday night in the middle of February. Harry had been tracking Quirrell's evening patterns since December and had mapped them with enough precision to know that Tuesday evenings between 8 and 10 were when Quirrell went to the third floor. Not every week, irregularly enough to avoid pattern detection by anyone not paying close attention, but with sufficient frequency to confirm that Voldemort was feeling the timeline and making his moves. He went to the third floor at 8:30, alone. He'd told Hermione and Ron to stay in the common room. Hermione had objected, at length, with specific counterarguments, which he'd answered point by point until she ran out of points and switched to simple objection, which he'd acknowledged and overruled because her presence was less useful than her position outside the situation with full information, able to act if he didn't come back. Ron had looked at him with those eyes that did the reading without analyzing and said nothing, but the way he said it was its own kind of agreement. The third floor was empty. He went to the locked door and stopped. Quirrell was already inside. Harry could hear him, or hear the thing that was using Quirrell, the occasional hiss of something that was not quite Parseltongue and not quite speech, the sharp frustrated sound of someone who'd been working at a problem for a long time and was not making progress. Harry put his hand on the door. The door opened. He walked in. The three-headed dog was unconscious, the calming draft in the water, as he'd suspected, but more of it this time. All three heads down, breathing in that unsensed three-part rhythm, the trapdoor beneath them visible and open, the dark below it significant. Quirrell turned around. For a moment they just looked at each other, Quirrell, who was approximately 40% himself at this point and 60% something wearing him, and Harry, who stood in the doorway with his hands loose at his sides and his wand not drawn. Potter, Quirrell said. His voice had the quality it always had in these moments, the layered register, his own tenor sitting on top of something that came from deeper down and didn't care about pitch. Professor, Harry said. Then, because it seemed more efficient, he looked past Quirrell to the turban and addressed what was actually there. You've been watching me since Halloween. The quality of Quirrell's expression changed. The 40% of him that was still Quirrell got a little smaller. Yes, said the voice that was not Quirrell's. You have been, interesting. I'll take that, Harry said. You won't get the stone tonight. Won't I? The turban shifted. I have managed the dog. I have studied the protections below. Dumbledore is away from the school, yes, I ensured this, the path is clear. The path is clear, Harry agreed. But you'll still fail. You are 11 years old, the voice said. Not unkindly. With the curiosity of something that was genuinely trying to understand. You have been trained by Croaker's people. I know what they produce. But what they produce is not sufficient to stop what I have become. What have you become? Harry asked. He was genuinely curious and it came through in the question. Something moved through Quirrell's face. Not offense. Interest. You ask without fear. Fear doesn't particularly help me think, Harry said. What have you become? Honestly. You're a fragment of what you were. You're divided from yourself by your own choices. You're dependent on a host who is dying by inches because you're killing him, and you need the stone because without it you have no path forward that isn't parasitic. He looked at the turban. That's not what you became. That's what you were reduced to. The silence was very complete. Then Quirrell moved. Harry had been waiting for it, not the specific timing but the inevitability, and he moved at the same moment, not backwards but sideways, clearing the line and letting Quirrell's first spell pass through the space his head had occupied. It hit the wall. The dog stirred in its sleep but didn't wake. Harry had his wand out and was already moving, because the first principle of any engagement with someone more powerful than you was never, under any circumstances, to stand still. Blythe had spent 3 years making this physical law by the simple method of hitting him every time he stopped moving during a drill, until moving became as automatic as breathing. Quirrell was technically skilled. Harry registered this in the first 5 seconds, the spell selection was precise and the casting speed was higher than the standard for someone who appeared to be a nervous, stammering professor. Voldemort's influence, obviously. Voldemort had been a technically extraordinary duelist before he'd fragmented himself. But Voldemort was working through a dying host body with degrading neural function and a grip on physical reality that was increasingly limited to what he could force Quirrell to do. Harry was in his own body with complete proprioceptive integration and 2 years of drilling with Blythe, who was not a nice sparring partner. He blocked, redirected, moved. He didn't match Quirrell's power, he had no reason to match it. He moved around it the way water moved around a stone, not through force but through the efficient exploitation of angles. When Quirrell's casting arm came up for the 4th time, Harry hit the elbow joint with a targeted stinging hex, not damaging, just precise, and Quirrell's aim broke and the spell went into the ceiling. He ended it by transfiguring the floor under Quirrell's feet into something that wasn't solid, which was 6th-year transfiguration at least, and Quirrell went down hard and stayed there for the moment it took Harry to cross the room and press his wand to the turban before Quirrell had fully processed what had happened. Don't, Harry said, to the thing in the turban. Level. Not threatening, simply informative. The silence this time was different. You, the voice said, from the turban, with an intensity that was recognizably not Quirrell's. You are not what Dumbledore said you were. What did Dumbledore say I was? A pause. He said you were protected. That you were, innocent of what was coming. That you did not know. Dumbledore, Harry said, has been revising that assessment since September. The boy who lived, the voice said, slowly. Not mocking. More like tasting something unfamiliar. They called you that. As if surviving were the significant thing. It wasn't the significant thing, Harry said. It was a byproduct. Of what? Harry looked at the turban. He thought about the mirror. The afternoon kitchen. His mother at the table. Of the fact that she loved me enough that dying was a choice rather than a defeat, he said. That's the mechanics of it. You know that. You felt what it did to your curse. The voice was quiet. You're not getting the stone, Harry said again. Not tonight. And I'm going to tell you clearly so there's no ambiguity, if you come at me or the people I'm responsible for again this year, I will stop being careful about what happens to your host. He looked at Quirrell's face, pale, sweating, still. He's dying anyway. I know that. But slowly is different from quickly, and what quickly costs you matters. You would kill him, the voice said. Still that quality of intellectual interest. Not outrage. A child. I'm not a child, Harry said. I'm the thing you made when you killed my parents in front of me and then tried to kill me and failed. He stepped back, withdrew the wand, let Quirrell breathe. Now get up. Go back to your quarters. This door gets reported to Dumbledore by morning and the protections get reinforced. You've lost tonight's window. Quirrell was shaking. Both of him, the human parts and whatever lived behind them. He got up slowly, the way people got up when their bodies had been instructed to do something by a brain that wasn't fully in residence. He looked at Harry with eyes that were briefly, completely, only Quirrell, and there was something in that, in the human part of him, that Harry registered and held carefully, because Quirrell the person was a different problem from Voldemort in the turban and deserved separate consideration. Quirrell left through the door. Harry heard his footsteps on the third-floor corridor, irregular and fading. Harry stood in the room with the sleeping dog and the open trapdoor and let himself breathe for a moment. His heart rate was elevated, not dramatically, not the flooding panic of genuine fear, but the clean uptick of a body that had been doing something requiring full attention and was now coming down from it. He noted it. Let it settle. Then he closed the trapdoor, latched it, and went to report to Dumbledore. Dumbledore was back by 2 in the morning, which suggested that whoever had pulled him away from the school had received a very efficient countermessage from someone in the ministry. Harry suspected Croaker, who had known where Dumbledore was because Croaker kept track of where powerful people were as a professional habit. The headmaster's office had the quality of a room that had recently been empty and hadn't quite adjusted back to occupied. Fawkes was awake, though, and watched Harry come in with the burning attention of something that knew more than it was saying, which was probably just what phoenixes were like. Harry sat down before Dumbledore could indicate the chair, which wasn't rudeness, just efficiency, and told him what had happened. Everything. The door, Quirrell's pattern, the confrontation. He was precise and chronological and left nothing out, including the exact exchange. When he finished, Dumbledore sat with his hands laced on the desk and said nothing for a moment. You faced him, Dumbledore said. Voldemort. A fragment of him in a dying host, yes. Harry, Dumbledore paused. Chose his words with the care of someone for whom words were tools rather than decoration. What you did was extraordinary. And it was also, another pause, something that should not have been necessary. I know, Harry said. The protections should have been better. Or you shouldn't have left the school. He looked at Dumbledore without accusation. I'm not angry about it. But it shouldn't happen again. No, Dumbledore agreed. It should not. He looked at Harry for a long moment. The stone needs to move. Or its protections need to be reconsidered significantly. The stone is fine where it is, Harry said. What needs to change is that Quirrell has Tuesday evenings free. He's using them consistently. And someone is sending Dumbledore away from the school in a pattern that correlates with Quirrell's access attempts. He leaned forward slightly. Whoever is manufacturing reasons to pull you out, that's the more immediate problem. Dumbledore looked at him. You've been tracking my schedule. Since October. And you've identified a correlation. 3 times since December, Harry said. The incidents are different each time, different urgency, different stated origin, but they cluster on Tuesday evenings and they're always just credible enough to act on. He paused. Someone in the ministry is helping. Not necessarily someone who knows what the help is for. But someone with access to sufficient authority to generate believable emergencies. Dumbledore sat with this for a moment. That is a longer reach than I had anticipated from Voldemort in his current state. He's been planning this for years, Harry said. Probably since the night he survived. The host is Quirrell, but the strategy is his. He's very patient when he has to be. Yes, Dumbledore said quietly. He always was. The fire settled. Fawkes made a small sound. Tell me something, Harry said. He'd been holding this question since the confrontation in the third-floor room, turning it over in the way he turned over things that had surprised him. In the third floor. He said you told him I was innocent of what was coming. That I didn't know. Dumbledore met his eyes. Did you tell him that? Harry asked. Or did he infer it? A pause. I may have allowed a certain impression to persist, Dumbledore said. The impression that the boy in the Department of Mysteries had been kept sheltered. Kept ignorant. He held Harry's gaze. I did not correct information that served to underestimate you. How long has that information been circulating? Since before you arrived at Hogwarts. Since the year you were placed with Croaker, there have been channels of communication I've been aware of. Methods by which information about you could be gathered by those who wish to track you. He paused. I made choices about what those channels found. Harry sat with this. Dumbledore had been managing his reputation as an asset before he'd even known he had one. He turned it over and looked at all its faces. It was strategic. It was a use of Harry as a piece on a board. It had also, objectively, worked tonight, because Voldemort had come at him expecting someone young and protected and had found something considerably different. All right, Harry said. Dumbledore blinked. All right. It worked. The information I have is more valuable than whatever I'd have gotten from knowing sooner. He paused. Don't do it again without telling me first. If you're going to manage how I'm perceived, I want to know what you're saying. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Then, that is, an entirely reasonable request. Good, Harry said. He stood up. The stone's protections need a review. I can contribute to the theoretical framework if you want another perspective. The department has models for layered containment that are more sophisticated than most standard wizarding security. He moved toward the door. And you should talk to Snape. About? About whether he knows what Quirrell is hosting. Harry opened the door. Because if he does and he hasn't told you, that's interesting. And if he doesn't and he finds out, he's going to want to act, and Snape acting alone on this is a variable neither of us wants. He was in the corridor before Dumbledore answered. Sometimes, Dumbledore said, from inside the office, mostly to Fawkes and the portraits, I am startled by the degree to which I missed 11 years. He found Hermione and Ron awake in the common room, which he'd expected, and told them both everything, which he'd already decided to do before he'd left the third floor. Hermione listened with her red notebook out and her face in the expression of controlled response that meant she was feeling things she'd decided to process after she had the full picture. Ron listened in complete silence, which was his version of the same thing. When Harry finished, Hermione said, carefully, you could have been killed. I wasn't, Harry said. That's not the same as it not being a possibility. No, Harry agreed. It's not. She looked at him. He could see her doing the thing where she was deciding what she was actually trying to say versus what she was saying. Next time, she said, with precision, you tell us where you're going. You'd have tried to come. Obviously, she said. That's the point. Harry looked at her. Something in her expression was very clear and very straightforward and slightly infuriating in the way that things were infuriating when they were right. He thought about Croaker's voice on the resonance device. You are not the solution to this problem on your own, regardless of your training. Fine, he said. Next time. Ron exhaled. Just slightly. Right, he said. Good. He paused. How good was the fight? Ron, Hermione said. I'm just asking. It was efficient, Harry said. Not particularly extended. The floor transfiguration ended it. Ron looked delighted in spite of himself. You transfigured the floor. 6th year level at least, Hermione said, in the voice of someone who had opinions about the curriculum not covering this. He's been doing 6th year work in private since, she stopped. Looked at Harry. Since before Hogwarts. Some of it, Harry said. What else, she said, can you do that's not on the current syllabus? Hermione. I'm serious. If we're in this together, I need to know your actual capabilities. He looked at her. He looked at Ron. He thought about what it meant that these two people had waited up for him, that they'd been here when he came back. All right, he said. Here. He spent the next hour telling them what he knew how to do, and Hermione took notes, and Ron occasionally said things like obviously or that's insane or wait, you can do that without a wand. Depending on the entry, and the fire burned down slowly, and outside the castle the winter dark held them in without pressure, without urgency, and Harry thought, not for the first time and with slightly less resistance than before, that whatever this was, it was real. Snape called him to his office on a Thursday morning. The potions office was everything you would expect from Snape's aesthetic, which was to say it was cold, precisely organized, and lined with jars containing things that were probably fine and looked like they weren't. Snape was standing at his desk when Harry came in, and he turned with the controlled deliberateness of someone who had prepared for this conversation and then kept preparing until the preparation became its own kind of tension. Sit, Snape said. Harry sat. Dumbledore has spoken to me, Snape said. About Tuesday night. I assumed he would, Harry said. Snape looked at him for a long moment. His expression was doing its complex private thing, the thing Harry had been cataloging since September and still couldn't fully decode because it had too many layers, too much history behind it that Harry didn't have direct access to. You faced the Dark Lord, he said. The formal name, not Voldemort, which itself was a tell about the period of his history that lived most prominently in his body. A fragment of him, Harry said. A fragment that is, in some configurations, more dangerous than the whole, Snape said. Because a whole entity has more to lose. A fragment operates without that limitation. Harry looked at him with interest. That's a precise analysis. I am a precise person, Snape said, with no particular warmth but also no edge. Harry turned this over. You know what he is, he said. What's in Quirrell? You worked it out. Snape's silence was confirmation. Since when? Since the start of term, Snape said. Quirrell's return from Albania had a signature that was inconsistent with how he left. I have particular experience with the Dark Lord's magical presence. He paused. The pause had old weight to it. I recognized it. You recognized it and didn't tell Dumbledore. I told Dumbledore I had concerns about Quirrell, Snape said. I told him I was monitoring the situation. I did not say, explicitly, what my concerns were, because an explicit accusation required more certainty than I had at the start of the year, and because, he stopped. His jaw tightened slightly. Making claims about the Dark Lord's survival without evidence is not a course of action I take lightly. Harry understood that there was a great deal more under this sentence than the sentence contained. Fair, he said. Snape looked at him, and this time the expression was different, the layers still there but resolved into something more direct, the particular look of someone who has decided to take a risk. You dealt with the turban, he said. Not Quirrell. You spoke to what was in the turban. Yes. What did it say to you? That I was interesting, Harry said. That I wasn't what he expected. No, Snape said quietly. You would not be. They sat in the cold office with the jars of ambiguous things around them and didn't speak for a moment. Professor, Harry said. I want to ask you something directly, and I'd like a direct answer. Ask. Whose side are you on? The silence this time was very complete. Snape's face went through something that was, briefly, unguarded, just a flash of it, a moment of something raw and specific underneath all the professional control, before it settled back into its habitual arrangement. Dumbledore's, he said. For reasons that are mine. He looked at Harry. And yours, it would seem. For reasons that are also mine. Harry sat with this for a moment. My mother, he said. Snape said nothing. But he didn't deny it either, and the quality of his not denying was different from strategic silence. All right, Harry said. I just needed to know. He stood to go. Potter. Snape's voice, level. Harry stopped. What you did on Tuesday night was, reckless. It was planned. It was reckless, Snape repeated. The fact that you planned it does not make it not reckless. Planning and reckless are not mutually exclusive. He paused. You are apparently extremely capable. You are not impervious. There is a distinction. Harry looked at him. You sound like Croaker. Something moved across Snape's face. Very brief. Very private. Yes, he said. I imagine I do. Harry left. In the corridor, he stopped for a moment and thought about the conversation, the parts that were explicit and the parts that weren't. He thought about a man who had loved his mother enough that it had reorganized his loyalties, and who was sufficiently complicated that love and cruelty lived in the same person without canceling each other out. He filed Snape not as an asset or a liability but as something more specific, a person, with a person's contradictions, who had made choices he was living inside. That, Harry thought, was a category he was beginning to understand. March arrived and the pressure on the third floor increased again, and the quality of the term shifted from its February steadiness into something with more urgency underneath it. Quirrell was declining visibly, not dramatically, not in ways that the general student population would identify as significant, but to Harry's specific attention the pattern was clear. The host was failing. The fragment was pushing harder. Something was going to happen before the year ended. Harry spent a lot of time in the library during March, working through what he knew about the remaining protections below the trapdoor. He and Hermione had done a theoretical reconstruction of the protection sequence based on what they could observe from above, the signatures that seeped up through the trapdoor when it had been briefly open. They had, between them, assembled a reasonable map. Hermione pushed a parchment across the table at him one Tuesday evening. The mirror is last, she said. Harry looked at the map. Yes. The mirror. Erased. It shows you what you desire. She looked at the map. The protection is, what? You can't get the stone without facing the mirror, and the mirror only gives the stone to someone who wants to find it but not use it. Essentially, Harry said. He had told her about the mirror. Not about what it had shown him, that was still filed, still managed, still not something he was ready to make into information, but about its mechanism and its location. She had worked out the protection design in approximately 4 minutes. That's elegant, she said, with genuine admiration for the spell architecture. Dumbledore does elegant work, Harry said. Would it work on Voldemort? In theory. He wants the stone to extend life, to build a body, ultimately. He'd see himself embodied, powerful, using the stone. Not simply holding it. Harry looked at the parchment. The protection should hold. Should, Hermione said. Should, Harry agreed. There are variables. Such as what happens if what he most desires is simply having the stone, divorced from the using of it. Desire is a specific thing. If he's contained his desire down to the object itself, then the mirror gives it to him, Hermione finished. She sat back. Can that be worked around? Not from outside the mirror, Harry said. But someone who understood the mirror's mechanism, who could stand in front of it and not want, not in the specific way the mirror reads desire, could interact with the stone without the protection activating against them. Hermione looked at him. He could see the understanding arrive. You're not going to let Voldemort get there, she said. No. Because even if Dumbledore's protection holds, there are 4 other layers between the trapdoor and the mirror, and Voldemort has had all year to study them, and if he makes it to the mirror in a state where his desire is sufficiently abstracted, then Dumbledore's elegant design might be insufficient, Harry said. Yes. She looked at the map for a moment. When, she said. Soon. April or May. He's running out of time in that host. Harry folded the parchment. I want to be the one who gets there first. Before he does. Get the stone out of the mirror, get it back to Dumbledore. He'll try to stop you. He'll try, Harry agreed. Hermione looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and picked up her quill and started writing something new, a different kind of list, he could see, the kind with decision trees, the kind she made when she was preparing for something. She was not asking permission and she was not waiting to be included. She was planning. Harry picked up his own quill. They planned together, in the library, while the castle moved around them and the torches burned low, and the thing below the 3rd floor door continued its patient, failing pressure, and outside the March wind came off the hills and touched the windows and moved on, and somewhere deep in the Ministry of Magic an old man in plain grey robes looked at his instruments and felt the frequency of what was coming, and was not surprised, because he had been watching this boy for 11 years and was beginning to understand what he was.